The pony stopped. Louis Diemschutz held the reins loose in his hand. Rain had fallen earlier that night, and the cobbles of Berner Street still shone under the dim gas lamps. He had come back late from Westhow Hill Market, his small barrow still piled with cheap costermonger jewellery. He had failed to sell that day. He turned the cart toward the narrow gateway of Dutfield's yard, the same gateway he had passed through countless times before. But the pony shied to the left and would not move. He leaned forward in his seat. The yard beyond the gate was very dark. He could just make out the long wall of the workingmen's club, where lamplight glowed faintly through the upstairs windows. Inside, voices were still rising and falling. A meeting. A song. The muffled sound of men who did not yet know what lay outside. Diemschutz lifted his whip and prodded at the shape on the ground. It was soft. It would not lift. He climbed down from the cart, struck a match against the wet stone, and bent low. The small flame found her face first, then her throat. The match went out. Chapter 1. A quiet welcome in the autumn of terror. Good evening and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world outside has grown small. The lamps are low and the room is warm, and there is nothing to do for a little while but rest, and let the slow weight of the past settle gently down upon the present. This is the Bedside Historian, and tonight, as the hour grows late, the listener and the storyteller will drift backward together to a time when the fog of London was thick with coal smoke, and the gas lamps hissed softly in the rain, and the east end of the city was about to enter the strangest and darkest autumn it had ever known. Before the long telling begins, the historian would like to know where the listener is tonight, and what hour the clock has reached in that quiet place. Is the rain falling there too, or is the moon fallen white above a sleeping town? Is the listener far from London, in some distant country where the air is warmer and the night crickets are still humming in the leaves? Or is the hour close to midnight and the rest of the house long asleep, and only one small lamp burning beside the bed? Wherever the listener may be, and whatever the hour, the historian is glad of the quiet company. If long, slow journeys into the past such as this one prove a help on the long nights, then please do think of subscribing to the channel, and of giving the video a small mark of approval, and of leaving a soft word in the comments below. For these small kind gestures help the candle of the Bedside Historian to keep burning, and they help the storyteller to reach others who lie awake in the long hours and who wish for company in the dark. The historian is grateful for every listener, and for every soul who has stayed through the long telling of a sad and ancient tale. And so let us begin. Let us drift backwards slowly through the long years, until we stand once again in the autumn of the year 1888 in the great and terrible city of London. The leaves of the plane trees were brown by then, and they lay in wet piles along the gutters of Whitechapel, and the River Thames, which moved like a sleeping serpent through the heart of the city, was thick with mist most mornings, and thick with the smell of coal smoke and salt and the rotting straw of the docks. The summer had been hot. The autumn had come quickly. By the end of September, the East End of London was no longer the place it had been, only a few short months before. Something had begun there, something that no one yet understood. The East End in those years was the poorest quarter of the richest city in the world. It was a place where many tongues were spoken on a single street, and where the smell of fried fish, of horse dung, of damp brick, and of unwashed wool hung together in a thick and unmoving cloud above the cobbles. The streets were narrow, and the lamps were few. Whole families slept 4 to a bed in rooms no larger than a coal cellar, and small children carried buckets of water up 4 flights of stairs each evening, because there was no pump above the ground floor. There were Polish Jews and Russian Jews and Irish dockers and Swedish sailors and Old English costermongers with their wooden barrows of bruised fruit, and they all lived together in the great labyrinth of brick and shadow that lay between Aldgate in the west and the Limehouse Cut in the east. The richer parts of London barely knew this district existed, but that summer the rich had begun to learn. On the last day of August, in a foul little turning called Buck's Row, the body of a woman named Mary Ann Nichols had been found lying on the wet flagstones, with her throat cut open from ear to ear, and the blood had run black in the gaslight. Her name had been new to the newspapers then, and her story had soon faded, as the stories of poor women so often did. But a week later, on the 8th of September, another woman had been found, this one in the backyard of a lodging-house in Hanbury Street. Her name was Annie Chapman, and she had been killed in a far worse way than the first, and the dark, terrible details of what had been done to her body had filled the newspapers from one coast of the kingdom to the other. The killer had not been seen. The killer had not been heard. He had passed through the streets of Whitechapel like a draught of cold air under a door, and he had vanished again before the first watchman could even raise his lantern. And now, 3 weeks later, as September drew toward its close, a strange hush had fallen upon the East End. The men still went to the public houses, and the women still hawked their wares in the markets, and the costers still pushed their wooden barrows along the commercial road, but the doors of the lodging houses were closing earlier in the evening. The streets after midnight were emptier than they had ever been, and the women who had no roof over their heads, and who walked the alleys at night looking for the price of a bed, found themselves more alone than they had ever been before. There were murmurings of a name that no one was quite certain how to pronounce. Leather Apron, some called him. The Whitechapel fiend, the murderer of Hanbury Street. He had no other name yet. He was only a shape in the rumour and the fog, a shape that walked the streets at night, and among the women who walked those same streets, there were 3 who would soon enter the darkest pages of that autumn together. One was an Englishwoman named Catherine, who came originally from the iron and coal town of Wolverhampton, far to the north. Another was a young Irish girl named Mary Jane, who lived in a small room in Miller's Court and dreamed of going home. And the third, the one whose long and strange life this telling concerns, was a Swedish woman who had come to London more than 20 years before, and who in the courts and lodging houses of Whitechapel was known by the name of Long Liz. Her real name was Elisabeth Gustafsdotter. She had been born in a small farming village west of Gothenburg on the cold rim of the North Sea in the year 1843. Her childhood had been spent among the wheat fields and the cattle barns and the wooden churches of rural Sweden. Her hands in those first years had known nothing but the soft work of the milk pail and the rough work of the hay rake. Yet by the autumn of 1888 those same hands had grown thin and worn, and they were the hands of a woman who slept 4 nights of every 7 in the common dormitory of a doss house, where the beds were ropes strung along a wall, and where the strangers around her snored and coughed and quarrelled, until the first grey light came through the dirty window panes. How she had come to that place, from that other one, is a long road, and tonight the historian will walk it slowly, while the wet city outside the lodging-house wall waits for the storm that is already gathering in the dark. The last days of September in 1888 were wet and cold. A fine rain had been falling for most of the week, and the cobbles of the East End were slick and shining under the gas lamps each evening, and the smell of wet horsehair and wet wool was strong on every corner. The men who unloaded the ships at the West India Dock came home with their boots soaked through, and the women who sold flowers at Spitalfields Market came home with their bunches of pinks and violets half spoiled by the damp. Inside the lodging-houses, the air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and clay pipes, and the long deal tables in the kitchens were crowded each night with the same faces, eating the same thin stew, speaking the same low complaints. On the evening of Saturday, the 29th of September, the rain was falling once more. The lamps had been lit early. The wind blew gently from the river, and in a narrow doss house on a narrow street called Flower and Dean, a Swedish woman of 44 years, with grey eyes and dark brown curly hair and a quiet, slow manner of speech, stepped out into the wet evening and turned her face toward the east. She wore a long black jacket of cheap wool, and a pair of side-spring boots that had been mended more than once, and a pinned bunch of small red and white flowers fastened to her chest above the breast. She had told the housekeeper that she had been earning a little by cleaning the rooms of the other lodgers that afternoon, and now she was going out for a small while. She did not say where. She did not say with whom. The yard of the lodging-house was empty as she passed out into Flower and Dean Street. The brick walls on either side of her were stained with damp. The smell of the river was on the wind, and somewhere, far down the long crooked passages that led from Spitalfields toward the docks, the first slow notes of a barrel organ were turning in the rain. She walked east into the gaslight. To know what Whitechapel was in that wet autumn, one must first imagine the great wealth of the city that lay only a mile to the west. The Bank of England stood there, with its high stone walls and its iron-bound gates, and its vaults full of more gold than any small country on earth could spend in a generation. The wide avenues of Holborn and the Strand had begun to be lit by the new electric lamps, and the gentlemen and the ladies who walked those pavements wore silk hats and fur-trimmed cloups against the September wind. The cabs that rolled past their feet were drawn by glossy chestnut horses, and the air smelt of good cigars and of fresh bread from the great bakehouses of Fleet Street. That was the London of the painted prints and the morning papers. The London of Whitechapel was not the same city at all. It had once, long ago, been a quiet country parish, a small place of farms and orchards, and a single white church with a tall, slim spire. But the great factories had come, and the great docks had come, and the railway lines had come, and in only 40 or 50 years the green fields had been swallowed by brick. The orchards had been cut down for tenements. The little streams had been bricked over for sewers. And by 1888 the parish was a maze of mean streets. 100,000 souls crammed into a square mile, with no fresh air, and no clean water, and no quiet corner where a poor woman might lay her head, except in the common lodging-houses, where she paid her 4p for a bed and her 2 more pence for a small piece of bread and a cup of weak black tea. The streets of the East End were not like the streets of the West End. They were narrow, and they were crooked, and they were paved with rounded cobbles that turned the ankle of any walker who did not know them. The houses were old. Many had been built in the days of the kings before Queen Victoria, and their timbers had grown soft with damp, and their plaster had cracked, and their slate roofs had begun to slip. There was no electric light here. There was only the gas, in its iron lamps on tall iron poles, and the gas lamps stood far apart. And between them the streets were as dark as the inside of a coal scuttle. The constables of the Metropolitan Police walked those streets in pairs and in threes. They wore tall blue helmets with a small silver star above the brim, and long blue coats buttoned to the chin, and at their belts they carried a wooden truncheon and a small tin lantern that burned a small flame of paraffin oil. They walked their beats by the same long route each night, and a clever man, if he watched the corner of his street for a single quarter of an hour, could learn the very minute at which the constable would pass. A clever man could learn that. A patient man could learn it too. And so the long Saturday evening of the 29th of September wore on, in the rain and the gaslight, and the slow turning of the constables on their beats. The public houses were full. The lodging houses were closing their doors against the cold. And in the wet alley of Berner Street, on the south side of the commercial road, only a few souls were still abroad, while inside the long brick building of the International Working Men's Educational Club, the men of the meeting were still arguing about politics, and a fiddle was still playing, and a young voice was singing a slow tune in a tongue that few in London could understand. The night had only begun. And in the lodging-house on Flower and Dean Street, the housekeeper, a kindly woman by the name of Elisabeth Tanner, was already wondering when Long Liz would come home. Chapter 2. The farmer's daughter of Torslander. Long before the great city of London ever swallowed her into its gaslit alleys, before her thin hands ever scrubbed the wooden floors of a doss house in Spitalfields, before her name ever appeared in any English newspaper or any English coroner's book. She was only a small girl in a small village on the far western edge of the kingdom of Sweden. The village was called Stora Tumlet. The parish was called Torslander, and the world she was born into, on the cold afternoon of the 27th of November in the year 1843, was so far removed from the one in which she would die that it scarcely seemed to belong to the same century at all. Torslander lay upon a long flat tongue of land that reached out into the grey waters of the Kattegat, the narrow sea that separated Sweden from the kingdom of Denmark. The wind there blew almost without rest, and it carried the salt of the sea and the smell of the kelp that lay drying upon the shore. The land was low. The trees were few, and they were bent by the wind. There were small grey fields where rye and barley grew, and there were small stone churches with steep wooden roofs, and there were scattered farmhouses painted in the deep red of the Falun copper mines, with white-trimmed windows and turf laid thick upon the roofs. The farm of Stora Tumlehed was one such place. It was held by a man named Gustaf Eriksson, who was then 32 years of age, and his wife Beata Karlsdotter, who was a year older than her husband. They were quiet people. They were Lutheran in the old, severe way of the Swedish countryside, and they kept the Sabbath, and they kept the long fast of Advent, and they made the long walk to the village church each Sunday morning, whether the snow was deep upon the path, or the summer sun was high above the fields. They were not poor. They were not rich. They were of the small farming class that had held that land for many generations, and that would hold it for many more. Their second child, a daughter, was born to them in the late autumn of 1843, The winter had come early that year, and the first frost had whitened the rye stubble nearly a month before her birth. And the small windows of the farmhouse were already sealed with paper against the cold when the small thin cry of the child was first heard in the upper room. The midwife who attended the birth was a woman from the next farm. The child was wrapped in a shawl of grey wool that had been spun by the grandmother, and on the 8th day of her life, on the 5th of December, she was carried in her father's arms to the parish church of Torslanda, and the pastor laid his hand upon her small forehead and named her, in the cold water of the stone font, Elisabeth Gustafsdotter. The name was given in the old Swedish way, Elisabeth for the saint, and for the cousin of the Virgin in the old Gospels. Gustafsdotter, the daughter of Gustaf, after the father whose name she carried. There were no fixed surnames as yet in the countryside of western Sweden. A child took the first name of the father, and the suffix son or daughter was added to it, and that was that, and so it had been since the days of the long ships. She was the second of 4 children in the family. There were 2 younger after her in the years that followed, and 1 older, and so she grew up in the small noisy company of brothers and sisters, in the warm, dim, smoky kitchen of the farmhouse, where the fire burned at all hours of the winter, and where the long bench beside the stove was the warmest place in all the world. She learned the small chores of the farm as soon as her small hands could be trusted with them. She fed the hens. She gathered the eggs, brown and warm, from the straw. She carried the small wooden pail of skimmed milk to the cottage of the old aunt who lived along the path that led to the sea. She learnt to spin a little flax on the wheel that stood in the corner. She learnt to knit, slowly, the long grey stockings that the men wore in the boats. The winters were long. The winters of Torslanda were among the longest in all the kingdom. The sun rose late and set early, and for many weeks of December and January, the small grey day was scarcely more than 4 hours long, and the rest was the deep blue of the long northern night. The wind from the Kattegat threw the snow against the windows of the farmhouse in slow heavy curtains, and the candles, which were made of tallow from the autumn's slaughter and which smelt sharply of the rendered fat of the sheep, were lit by mid-afternoon and were not put out again until late in the evening. The family ate by their light. The mother sewed by their light. And the small Elisabeth, in those long dark months of her childhood, learnt the slow patience that comes to all the children of the high northern lands. The summers, by contrast, were brief and dazzling. The sun rose at 3 in the morning and did not set until 10 in the evening, and the long pale twilight afterward seemed never quite to end. The wheat ripened in the small grey fields. The hay was cut and stacked on long wooden poles to dry in the sea wind. The cattle were taken up to the higher pasture, and the children walked behind them barefoot in the warm dust of the path. At midsummer, on the longest day of the year, the village raised a tall pole of birch and ribbon in the field beside the church, and the young people danced around it until the small hours of the morning, and the old people sat upon the low stone wall and watched them, and remembered. Elisabeth knew that life. She knew the smell of the wet hay in the late summer rain. She knew the dry sweet smell of the long winter barn with its dark beams above and its sleeping cows below. She knew the smell of the small grey lichens that grew upon the stones of the parish wall, and the smell of the salt water on the wind from the sea, and the smell of the bread that her mother baked in the iron oven on the long Saturday mornings, and the smell of the tar that the fishermen brushed upon the bottoms of their wooden boats down at the small stone quay of Torslanda Ham. She was educated, as the children of the parish were educated then, in parish school. She did not learn much. The schooling of the country children of Sweden in those years was a brief affair, conducted in the small bare room beside the church by a single thin schoolmaster who taught all the children of all the ages together, and who beat the slow ones with a thin birch rod, and who read aloud from the small black Lutheran catechism that was the foundation of all learning. Elisabeth learned to read, after a fashion. She learnt the long lists of the Swedish kings. She learned the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed, and the small hymns of the parish hymn book. And, when at last she was confirmed, on a cold morning in the parish church, with her hair plaited tight beneath a white kerchief, the pastor wrote in his register that she could read tolerably well, but that she had only a small understanding of the Bible and of the catechism. That was all. The book of her early childhood was closed. She was a quiet girl, by the small accounts that survive. She was tall for her age, with the dark hair and the grey eyes that her mother had given her, and she was thought to be more thoughtful than her sisters, and slower to laugh and slower to speak. She kept a small wooden cross above her bed, and a small dried sprig of heather, and a little ribbon of red wool that the grandmother had given her on her first confirmation day. She slept in a low truckle bed in the upper room of the farmhouse beside her sister, and on the long winter nights the breath of the two girls froze upon the inside of the small glass pane of the window, and they pulled the heavy woolen quilt close around their shoulders, and they listened to the wind from the sea. There was no shadow upon that childhood. There were no signs in the years of her early growing up of what was to come. She was a small Swedish farm girl, in a small Swedish parish, in a quiet corner of a quiet kingdom, and her name appeared in no record more remarkable than the parish register of births, deaths, and confirmations, and in the small fading notes that her mother kept in a leather-bound book of household accounts beside the bed. But the farm was small and the children were many, and the kingdom of Sweden in those years was changing fast. The harvests of the early 1850s had been thin, and the harvests that followed had been thinner still, and many young people of the parish were beginning to leave the small farms of Torslanda for the great new city of Gothenburg, which lay only a few hours to the east, at the mouth of the river Gotha. There, they said, the new factories were rising. There, they said, the steamships came in from England and from Germany, and the great cranes lifted bales of cotton from their holds, and the wages were paid in silver coin, and the streets were bright with new gas lights. The young men went first, hiring themselves out as porters at the docks and as labourers at the brickyards. The young women followed soon after, going into service in the houses of the merchants, washing and cooking and minding the children of the new rich. And so in the spring of the year 1860, when Elisabeth had reached the age of 16 years, and was a strong and tall young woman, with hair the colour of dark wood and eyes the colour of a grey winter sea, her father sat with her one evening upon the bench beside the iron stove, and he asked her if she would not think of going to the city as well. There was a cousin there, he said, who had a place in a good household. There was a small room above the kitchen where she might sleep. And he, the father, with the youngest still small and the work of the farm still hard upon his hands, could not keep her at home for many more winters. She listened to him for a long while. The fire crackled softly in the stove. The sea wind tapped at the small glass pane of the window. And when at last she answered him, she said only that she would think upon it through the night, and would give him her answer in the morning. In the morning she gave it. She would go to Gothenburg. She packed her small bundle in a length of long blue cloth that her mother had woven. She put into it her best Sunday dress of grey homespun wool, and a clean apron, and 2 pairs of woolen stockings, and her small wooden cross, and her small sprig of heather, and the little ribbon of red wool that the grandmother had given her. She kissed her sisters, and she kissed her brothers, and she let her father lay his hand upon her head, and say the old blessing of the Lutheran fathers. And then she stepped out into the morning, and she walked the long road to the small wooden quay of Torslanda Ham, where a low fishing boat was waiting to take her, with a few other passengers, across the wide grey water of the harbour to the city of Gothenburg, where the bells were already beginning to ring across the morning. She did not look back. Chapter 3. The Bells of Gothenburg. The city of Gothenburg, in the year that Elisabeth Gustafsdotter first walked into it, was the second largest city in the kingdom of Sweden. It lay upon the broad estuary of the river Gotha, where the river met the salt water of the Kattegat in a slow brown swirl, and it had grown rich in the past 50 years, upon the trade of timber, of tar, of iron ore from the long mines of the north, and of herring brought in by the small fleets of fishing boats that worked the cold waters off the coast. The houses along the canals were tall and narrow, in the old Dutch fashion, painted in deep yellow and pale red, with small white window frames and high steep roofs of black tile. The streets were paved with cobbles of grey granite. The great cathedral, called the Domkyrkan, stood at the heart of the city with its tall green copper spire, and its bells rang the hours over the rooftops in long deep notes that could be heard far down the river. To a girl of 16 years, from the small farm of Stora Tumlade, the city must have seemed a marvel beyond all imagining. There were horse-drawn omnibuses upon the broad streets, with their thin iron wheels rattling upon the cobbles. There were public lamps in every square, fuelled by the new town gasworks. There were great wagons of brewers' beer and brewers' barley, drawn by enormous draught horses, with thick brass bells upon their harness, and feathered hocks the size of a man's chest. There were sailors from England and from Russia and from the Netherlands, smoking long clay pipes upon the wharves. There were small Jewish merchants with long black coats and round black hats, and there were merchants' wives in silk crinolines that filled the whole width of the pavement. There were small boys selling matches and pickled herring and oysters from wooden trays slung about their necks. And there were the bells of the Domkirken, and the bells of the Christine Church, and the bells of the small German church by the canal, and the bells of the dockyards calling the men to work. Always in Gothenburg they were the bells. She was lodged, at first, in the parish of Karl Johan, which lay upon the south side of the harbour, between the city proper and the small fishing village of Majorna. She had been taken on as a domestic servant in the house of a respectable family of the merchant class, and her duties were the duties of all young women in service in those years. She rose at 5 in the morning. She lit the kitchen fire from the embers of the night before. She drew the water from the pump in the small backyard. She blackened the iron grate of the parlour. She scrubbed the wooden steps of the front entrance with hot water and grey soap. She set the table for the breakfast of the master and the mistress. She washed the dishes. She swept the rooms. She helped with the laundry on the Monday and the ironing on the Tuesday. And on the Saturday she scrubbed the kitchen floor from one corner to the other upon her hands and her knees with a thick block of yellow soap and a stiff brush of pig bristle. For all of this she received a small wage of perhaps 12 kroner a year, paid in 2 parts at midsummer and at Christmas. She received also a small attic room above the kitchen, with a low iron bed and a wooden washstand and a small window that looked out upon the canal. She received 2 simple meals a day, and the leavings of the table when the master and the mistress had risen. And she received on the Sunday afternoon a few hours of her own time, in which she might walk the streets of the city, or sit by the canal, or attend the long Lutheran service at the parish church, or write a slow, careful letter home in her small, slow hand upon a single sheet of cheap blue paper. She did not stay long in the house of Karl Johan. The records of the city, which were kept by the police and by the church with the same patient Swedish thoroughness that had always marked the kingdom, show that in the early part of the year 1862 she removed from that parish to the parish of the cathedral, in the district called Ostrahaga, and that she took lodging in a narrow street called Pilgatan, which ran behind the great stone walls of the bishop's house. The records do not say why she moved. They do not say what work she found there. They say only that she was registered in the new parish as a young woman from the country, and that her occupation was given as that of a serving maid. It is not certain when the first slow turning happened. It is not certain when the small, careful Swedish farm girl, with her grey eyes and her dark hair and her small Lutheran catechism in her pocket, began to walk in the late evenings of Gothenburg toward those streets in which the lamps were lit only dimly, and in which the young women in their bright cheap dresses leaned against the doorways and called softly to the sailors as they passed. It is not certain whether it began with a single bad evening, with a single kind man who proved unkind, with a single small purse offered in a dark hallway. It is not certain whether it began with hunger, with cold, with the small slow grinding of a wage that did not stretch from one quarter to the next. It is not certain whether it began at all in any single moment that one might name. But by the early spring of the year 1865, when she was 21 years of age, she had appeared upon a list that no young woman from Torslanda was meant ever to appear upon. The list was kept by the police of Gothenburg in a long leather-bound book in the offices of the city hall. It was the list of the registered women of the town, who were required by the public health laws of the kingdom to present themselves twice each month at the city hospital for the examination of the city physician, and to receive, if they were found to be in good health, a small printed card that they were obliged to carry upon their persons at all times. Upon that list, in the month of March in the year 1865, was inscribed a new name, Elisabeth Gustafsdotter, from the parish of Torslanda, lately of Pilgatan, Ostrahaga. The pen of the clerk made a small, careful number beside her name in the margin of the book, number 97. She was, by the careful counting of the city of Gothenburg in that year, the 97th woman of the lower town to bear that small dark mark. A month later, on the 21st day of April in the same year, she was delivered in a small lying-in hospital upon the south side of the river, of a daughter who had been born too soon. The child did not live. She had not been long enough in the womb. The small, unbreathing body was wrapped in a piece of unbleached linen, and was buried in the unmarked corner of the parish ground where the city kept its stillbirths. The mother was kept in the hospital for some days after, in a long ward with other women of the same kind, until she was well enough to walk again into the streets. There is no record of who the father of the child had been. There is no record of any sorrow that she felt. There is only the small careful note in the city hospital ledger, recording the small failed birth, and the small careful name of the mother, and the small date of the small undone life. She walked back into the streets of Ostrahaga in the soft spring rain. In the October of that same year she returned to the city hospital once more. This time the record is briefer still. She was treated, the clerk wrote in his small careful hand, for a venereal chancre. The treatment in those years was harsh. It was mercury, given in the form of small bitter pills, or in the form of a grey salve rubbed upon the skin, and it left the patient weak and pale, and with the slow ache of mercury poisoning that would stay in the bones for many years afterward. She came out of the hospital after some weeks of this, and she did not return to the streets in which she had been working. She found instead a new place of service in a house upon a street called Husagaten, where she was taken on once more as a maid in the kitchen, and where she stayed quietly through the long dark winter of 1865 and into the early days of 1866. The bells of the Domkirken rang above her in the cold mornings. The snow fell soft and slow upon the canals, and somewhere far to the west, in the small parish of Torslanda, the news at last reached her that her mother had died in the late summer of the year before, and that her small inheritance, 65 krona in silver coin, had at last been drawn out of the estate and was waiting for her at the office of a small notary in the city of Gothenburg. She went to that office on a grey morning in the late autumn. She signed the small ledger with her small, slow hand. She received the small leather purse, and she put it carefully into the inner pocket of her grey wool dress, and she walked back through the falling snow to the small attic room in Husagating, and she sat upon the low iron bed, and she counted the coins out upon the thin grey blanket, one by one. 65. It was enough. It was enough for the passage to England. She knew of England as the country to which the great ships sailed each week from the docks of Gothenburg. She knew of London as the great city at the end of that voyage. She knew, too, that there were Swedish people in London. There was a Swedish church there in the parish of St. George in the east, which had been built for the sailors and the dockhands and the small Swedish merchant families who had settled along the Thames in the long years of the northern trade. The pastor of that church kept a small register of arrivals. He helped young Swedes to find lodging. He could read a letter for a young woman who could not yet read English. He could write a letter for a young woman who could not yet write it. She made her decision in that small attic room in Husagaten, with the snow upon the window and the small purse of coins upon the blanket. On the 7th day of February in the year 1866, she presented herself at the office of the city authorities, and she applied for the certificate of removal that would allow her to leave the kingdom and to register herself in another. The clerk wrote in his book that her education was sufficient, that she could read tolerably well, that she had small understanding of the catechism, and that her character was unblemished by criminal record. The certificate was granted. She bought her passage at the office of a small shipping agent upon the harbour quay. She bought a small carpet bag at a draper's in the city. She put into it her grey dress and her woolen stockings and her small wooden cross and her small ribbon of red wool. She wrote a last letter home to her father, and she gave it to the post. And on a cold grey morning in the early summer of 1866, with the bells of the Domkirken ringing the 7 o'clock hour above the long brown river, Elisabeth Gustafsdotter walked up the wooden gangplank of a small iron steamer, and she stepped onto the deck, and she felt the engine of the ship begin to turn beneath her feet, and the harbour slowly began to slip away behind her in the morning mist. The bells of Gothenburg rang one last time across the water. She did not turn her head. Chapter 4. The long voyage to London. The voyage from the harbour of Gothenburg to the great port of London was, in the summer months of the year 1866, a journey of 4 or 5 days, and the small iron steamer that carried Elisabeth Gustafsdotter out of the river Göta and into the open water of the North Sea was a vessel of no great size, with 2 black funnels and a single set of low brown sails, and a small wooden deck-house where the third class huddled out of the wind. The third class was where she travelled. Her passage had cost her perhaps 8 or 10 of the 65 krona in her small leather purse. She had paid the money to a clerk in a small office upon the harbour quay, and she had received in return a small printed ticket of green pasteboard, with her name written upon it in the small slow hand of the clerk, and a small wax seal pressed into the corner. The ticket said only that the bearer was entitled to a small wooden bench beneath the deck-house, and to a single ration each day of weak coffee, of black bread, of pickled herring, and of a small piece of dry yellow cheese. She slept upon the bench. She slept in her grey wool dress and her grey wool shawl, with her small carpet bag for a pillow, and the small leather purse pinned with a small steel pin to the inside of her bodice, where it would lie warm against her skin all the long days and nights of the voyage. There were other women upon the third-class deck, some with small children, some with husbands, some alone like herself. And they spoke softly among themselves in Swedish and in Norwegian, and in a slow broken German, and they shared the small pieces of black bread among the smallest of the children. And they did not ask one another why they were going to England. The North Sea in early summer was rough but not cruel. The wind blew from the north and west. The waves were grey and long, and they rolled the small ship slowly from one side to the other through the long pale nights. The sky did not darken fully for any of the 4 days of the voyage, for the kingdoms of the north were still in their long summer twilight, and the sun set only just below the horizon and rose again only a few short hours later, and the small wakeful Swedes upon the third-class deck watched the slow horizon turn pink and grey and pink again above the long water. She did not speak much during those days. She watched the gulls follow the ship. She watched the small flying fish leap once or twice from the slow grey waves. She watched, in the early morning of the 4th day, the first low brown smear that appeared upon the western horizon, and the older Swedes upon the deck nodded to one another and said in low voices that the smear was the coast of England. The ship turned south and west. It moved slowly down the long coast of the kingdom, past the low chalk cliffs of Yorkshire, past the smoky chimneys of the port of Hull, past the broad flat mouth of the river Humber. The water grew thicker and yellower and slower with each hour as the ship moved on. The seabirds grew thicker too. And on the morning of the 5th day, the small iron steamer turned at last into the wide brown mouth of the River Thames, and Elisabeth Gustafsdotter stood at the small wooden rail of the deck, with her carpet bag in her hand and her small grey shawl pulled tight against her shoulders, and she watched as the great city of London slowly rose out of the morning mist before her eyes. She had never seen a city like it. No one from Torslanda had ever seen a city like it. The river was crowded with ships from every kingdom of the world, with the high white sails of the East Indiamen, and the low black hulls of the Newcastle colliers, and the small smoky steamers of the cross-channel trade, and the long lines of coal barges, and the small grey lighters, and the wooden boats of the river fishermen. The wharves on either side of the water stretched for miles, with their great wooden cranes lifting bales and barrels into the air, and their crowds of dockers swarming over the timbers like dark ants, and the long warehouses with the names of the great trading houses painted in white upon their dark brick walls. The smell of the river was a thick smell of coal smoke, and of tar, and of rotting fruit, and of horse dung, and of 1,000 other things mingled together, and it rose into the morning air in a low brown haze that hung above the city like a permanent fog. Her ship docked at last at the long stone quay of St. Catherine's Dock, beside the great pale walls of the Tower of London. The gangplank was lowered. The passengers of the third class came slowly down it, with their small bags and their small bundles and their small frightened children, and they were met at the bottom by the small army of porters and runners and lodging-house touts who waited for every ship that came in. She did not need a tout. She had been given an address. The pastor of the Swedish church in Prince's Square had been written to from Gothenburg in a small slow letter sent some weeks before her departure, and the pastor was expecting her. She walked away from the quay with her small carpet bag in her hand, and she asked her way in a slow, careful German from the small Swedish sailors upon the wharves. And she made her way east along the narrow streets of Wapping, past the public houses and the chandleries and the small lodging houses for sailors, and at last she came to the small square of red brick houses where the Swedish church stood, with its tall, slim tower and its small carved sign in the old Swedish letters above the door. The pastor was a kind man. He gave her a cup of weak tea in his small parlour above the church. He wrote her name into his great leather-bound register of arrivals, and he set the date of her registration as the 10th day of July in the year 1866. He noted that she had come from the parish of Torslanda. He noted that she was a young, unmarried woman of 23 years. He noted that she'd been confirmed in the Lutheran faith, and that she could read her own language tolerably well, but that she had no English at all. He helped her to find a lodging. The lodging was not in the East End. The lodging was in a quite different part of London altogether, in a long quiet street of tall narrow houses in the district of Bloomsbury, far to the north and the west, where the new University College had recently been built, and where the small respectable boarding houses of the central city took in young women of good character, who were seeking work in service. The street was called Gower Street. The number of the house was a small high number, painted in white above a black door. There was a small clean attic room above the third floor, with a low iron bed and a wooden washstand, and a small window that looked out across the slate roofs of the city toward the great dome of St. Paul's. The rent was 3 shillings and 6pence a week, paid each Friday in advance. She took the room. She was taken on within a fortnight as a serving maid in one of the larger houses upon the same street, where a respectable family of lawyers kept 4 servants in their tall thin house, and where the work was much the same as the work in Gothenburg had been, but where the wages were paid in good English silver, and the language was the slow strange tongue of the south. She set to learning that tongue. She set to it with the same slow patience that she had once set to learning the long lists of the Swedish kings. She bought, with a small portion of her wages, a small paper-bound book of English grammar, with the Swedish words upon the left-hand page and the English words upon the right, and each evening, by the small candle in her attic room, she read a few lines from it slowly aloud. She learnt the names of the streets of London. She learnt the names of the coins of the English realm, the small copper farthings and the silver sixpences and the Hiddelbright shillings and the gold half-sovereigns that she had never yet held in her hand. She learnt the small phrases of polite English, the good morning and the good evening and the if you please and the thank you kindly. And by the middle of the year that followed, in the late summer of 1867, she could hold a slow, careful conversation with the cook and the housekeeper in the kitchen at the house in Gower Street, and she could read a short newspaper paragraph with only a little help. The years that she spent in Gower Street were the quietest years of her grown life. She was a serving maid. She did her work. She attended the Lutheran service at the Swedish church each Sunday morning, walking the long walk across London from Bloomsbury to Wapping in her grey Sunday dress and her small black bonnet, and she returned in the afternoon to the kitchen of the house and helped the cook with the supper. She wrote letters home to her father, in the slow, careful Swedish hand that she had learnt at the parish school of Torslanda, and she received in return the slow, careful letters of her father, who told her of the small doings of the farm, and of the small doings of the farm, and of the small doings of her brothers and sisters, and of the slow turning of the seasons upon the cold coast of the Kattegat. Once or twice in those quiet years, she walked out in the evening with a young man. The records of the parish do not say his name. The records of the police do not say his name either. He was a young constable of the Metropolitan Force, the small accounts tell us, with the tall blue helmet and the long blue coat that all the constables of London wore in those years, and he was perhaps 2 or 3 years older than herself, and they walked out together for a small time in the long summer evenings of 1868, and they parted, for reasons that have not come down to us, before the year was out. But not come down to us, before the year was out. There is no record of any sorrow. There is no record of any love. There is only the small note in a later account that she had, in her quiet Bloomsbury years, briefly walked out with a young man of the police. She was not unhappy. She was not yet poor. She had her work, and her room, and her small attic window, and her small candle, and her small slow English grammar, and her small Swedish letters that came in the spring and the autumn from the cold farm at Torslanda. She had begun, in those quiet years, to think of herself by the English form of her name, Elisabeth Gustafsdotter, and in the small register of the Swedish church, when she signed her name each Sunday morning, she signed it slowly, in the new English letters, with the small careful loops that she had taught herself in her attic room. She was 25 years old in the autumn of 1868. She had been 4 winters in London. She had no husband and no child living, and no near family within 1,000 miles of her own narrow bed. That winter, in the small parish of St. Giles in the Fields, where the new university stood, and where the small narrow streets ran down to the long line of New Oxford Street, a man came in from the kingdom of Kent to take work at the carpenter's bench of a small ship's chandlery. He was a man of middle age, with a steady eye and a quiet manner, and he had been born in the small dockyard town of Sheerness, upon the long flat island that lay at the mouth of the river Medway, and he was looking, as men of middle age often look in a great new city, for a wife. His name was John Thomas Stride. Chapter 5. The Carpenter from Sheerness. He was not a young man by the small accounts that survive. He was 36 or 37 years old by the year that he first walked into a small chandlery in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields. More than 13 years, the elder of the quiet Swedish serving maid who lived in the attic of the house in Gower Street, and his life until that hour had been a hard one, in the slow, steady manner of all lives that were spent at the carpenter's bench of an English dockyard town. He had been born in the year 1830 or thereabouts in the small island town of Sheerness, which lay upon the western end of the Isle of Sheppey in the Kingdom of Kent. Sheerness was a town of the Royal Navy. It had been a naval dockyard for more than 200 years by the time of John Stride's birth, and the small grey streets of the town were lined with the small grey cottages of the dockyard families, and the great brick walls of the naval yard rose above them at the end of the long high street, with the high cranes of the slipways above, and the smell of pitch and of new oak from within. He had grown up among those cottages. He had learnt his trade at the carpenter's bench of one of the smaller commercial yards, where the small fishing smacks and the small coastal traders were built and repaired alongside the great warships of the navy. He had served his long apprenticeship of 7 years. He had earned his small certificate from the master of the yard. He had spent a season or two at sea on a small coastal trader running between Sheerness and the port of London, and he had then come up to the great city, as so many tradesmen of the Kingdom of Kent did in those years, to find steadier work and better wages. He found work easily. A ship's carpenter in London in the year 1868 could earn £3 a week, which was more than 3 times the wage of a working-class labourer, and a good carpenter who kept his tools clean and his bench tidy, and his temper steady, could keep that wage for the rest of his working life. John Stride was a good carpenter. He had a steady hand. He had a steady eye. He kept his tools in a small wooden chest beneath his bench, and he kept the chest locked at all hours of the day and night. He drank no more than the average tradesman of his time, which was to say a single pint of porter at the end of his working day, and perhaps a small glass of gin upon the Saturday evening. He attended chapel upon the Sunday in the small Methodist chapel that stood near to his lodging. He did not swear. He did not gamble. He was, by the small reckonings of his time, a steady and respectable man. It is not certain how he and Elizabeth came to meet. The small records of the parish do not say. The small records of the families do not say. There is no letter that has survived, no diary, no marked entry in any small private book. There is only the great fact that by the early winter of the year 1869 they were known to one another, and that by the early spring of the year 1869 they had agreed between them to be married, and that on the 7th day of March in that year they walked together up the wide stone steps of the parish church of St. Giles in the Fields, in the heart of the great city of London, and they stood together before the small wooden altar of the church, and they were joined in the bonds of holy matrimony by a clergyman of the Church of England, the Reverend Wetringf, the Rederackligians, Wyatt and 1N. Taylor. The bride gave her address upon the day of the wedding as number 67 Gower Street in the parish of Bloomsbury. She gave her name in the small careful New English form she had been teaching herself. Elisabeth Gustafsdotter. She gave her father's name as Gustaf Eriksson, a farmer of the Kingdom of Sweden. She signed her name in the small register of the parish in the slow, careful loops that she had practised in the attic room. She did not sign with an X, as so many of the working women of London did in those years. She had her letters. She had her name. The wedding was a small wedding. There were no relatives of the bride present. There were no flowers in her hair. She wore a plain dress of dark grey wool, and a plain bonnet of black straw, and a small bunch of white winter heather pinned to her breast, which she had bought that morning at a small flower stall in Covent Garden for the price of 1 penny. The bridegroom wore his Sunday suit of dark sarge, and his Sunday boots of polished black leather, and a small white linen collar that he had washed and starched himself the evening before. The clergyman read the words of the service from the small black prayer book. The witnesses signed their names. The bells of the church rang above the parish for a small short while, and then John Stride and his new wife walked out together into the cold March wind of London, husband and wife in the eyes of God and of the kingdom, and they did not return to the small attic room in Gower Street. They went instead by the slow horse-drawn omnibus that ran east along the long line of New Oxford Street and Holborn and Cheapside and the Whitechapel Road to the small set of rented rooms that John had taken for them in the district of Poplar near the West India Docks, where his work as a ship's carpenter would now be carried on at one of the small commercial yards along the river. The rooms were small, but they were clean. There were 2 of them, upon the second floor of a narrow brick house on the East India Dock Road, with a small iron grate in the front room and a small iron bedstead in the back, and a small set of 3 steps that led up to the front door from the wet cobbled street. The rent was 8 shillings a week, paid each Friday in advance. The house was kept by a Mrs. Hodges, a Methodist widow of perhaps 50 years, who lived upon the ground floor and who let out the upper rooms to married couples of good character. Elisabeth was now Mrs. Stride. She was Mrs. Elisabeth Stride of the East India Dock Road, Poplar. She was the wife of a respectable English tradesman, and she had her own front door and her own iron grate and her own iron bedstead, and her own small set of pots and pans, and her own small store of tea and sugar and flour upon the kitchen shelf. She was a married woman by the laws of England and by the small books of the parish, and she walks the streets of her new neighbourhood in her grey dress and her black bonnet with a small new pride that she had not known before, and she answered the morning greetings of the other women of the street with a small slow nod of her head and a small careful smile. She had been 25 years old at the time of her marriage. She was tall and quiet and steady. She had grey eyes and dark brown curly hair, and a pale clear skin, and a small slow Swedish accent that the women of Poplar found pleasing, and that the men of Poplar found, in some small way that they did not quite name, faintly mysterious. She did not speak of her past. She did not speak of the small dark months in the parish of Ostra-Haga, or of the small unbreathing child in the lying-in hospital of Gothenburg, or of the small grey salve and the small bitter pills of the city hospital, or of the small number in the leather-bound book in the city hall. The book of those years had been closed. She had crossed to the North Sea. She had begun again, for the first time in many years, in that small spring of 1869, in those 2 small rooms above the East India Dock Road, with the smell of tar and salt on the wind from the docks and the slow turning of the great cranes visible from her small back window, Elisabeth Stride was, perhaps, almost happy. It is hard to say. The records do not say. The records say only that in the early summer of that year, she and her husband sat together one evening at the small deal table of the front room, with a small pot of weak tea between them and the small iron grate burning low, and they began to make a small plan together. They would not stay in service to other men. He would not stay long at the carpenter's bench of another man's yard. They had a small store of savings between them, perhaps £15, and they had between them the strength of 4 good hands, and they had between them the stenty patience of 2 grown people who had each known some hard turnings in life. They would open a small business of their own. They would open, in one of the small commercial streets of Poplar, where the dockers came home tired and hungry each evening from the great wharves of the East India, a small coffee shop. It would be their own. They would call it by their own name. The Strides' Coffee Rooms. Chapter 6. The Coffee Rooms of Poplar. The first coffee shop of John and Elisabeth Stride opened its small doors upon a small narrow street called Crisper Street, in the parish of Poplar, in the early summer of the year 1870. Only a small year after their wedding at St. Giles in the Fields, and the small wooden sign above its small wooden door bore their name painted in white upon black, with the small careful flourishes that a small sign painter of Poplar High Street had added to it, for the price of an extra 6pence. A coffee shop, in the London of the year 1870, was not at all the kind of place that the words might suggest to the ear of a later age. It was not a place of soft chairs and quiet music and small bowls of foreign sweets. It was instead a small working men's eating house, with long deal tables and hard wooden benches and a low wooden counter, behind which the coffee urn hissed all day, and it served the dockers and the carmen, and the small clerks of the river trade with cheap hot meals from 5 in the morning until 10 at night. The coffee that it served was not the strong black coffee of the great hotels of the West End. It was a thin brown drink, brewed in a large copper urn, with a small handful of chicory, and a great quantity of cheap roasted beans, and it was served in heavy white china mugs with a small lump of brown sugar and a small splash of blue-tinned milk, and it cost the customer 1 penny the mug. A small loaf of bread cost a penny. A small slice of fried bacon cost 2pence. A small piece of strong yellow cheese cost a halfpenny. A small bowl of pea soup on the cold winter evenings cost 3 halfpence. A small piece of suet pudding on the long days of Lent cost the same. For 6pence in all, a working man could sit down at the long deal table of the Strides coffee shop and eat a hot meal that would carry him through to the morning of the next day, and the working men of Poplar did so in their many hundreds. The work was hard. The work was constant. John Stride rose at 4 in the morning. He went down the small wooden stairs from the small rooms above the shop, and he lit the small iron stove in the kitchen with kindling that he had laid the night before. He set the great copper urn upon the stove. He set the small iron pans upon it. He went out into the small cobbled yard behind the shop, and he drew the water from the pump, and he carried it back in 2 great pails. He cut the bread for the morning. He sliced the bacon. He stirred the porridge. And at 5 in the morning, when the first slow, heavy footsteps of the dockers began to sound upon the cobbles of Crisp Street, he unlocked the small wooden door of the shop and lit the small gas lamp above the counter. And the day began. Elisabeth worked beside him. She came down a short while after, in her grey work dress and her white apron and a small white cap pinned upon her dark hair, and she took her place behind the counter, and she served the dockers and the carman and the small clerks with a slow, careful patience that the working men of Poplar came to know well. She handed the heavy white china mugs across the counter. She counted the small copper coins into the small wooden till. She wiped the long deal tables with a small wet cloth as the men finished their meals and went out into the dawn. She washed the heavy white china in a great tin tub of hot water in the small back kitchen. She swept the floor with a long broom of birch twigs. She did all of this in the slow, steady manner of a woman who had been brought up to hard work, and she did it day after day and week after week and month after month, in the small, smoky shop on Crisp Street, with the smell of the coffee urn and the bacon pan and the wet cobbles outside in the rain. They prospered. The small shop on Crisp Street did well for the first year, and then for the second year, and by the early summer of the year 1870, they had moved the shop to larger and busier premises upon the broad thoroughfare of Upper North Street, only a few streets to the south. They moved again, in the spring of the year 1871, to a still larger shop at number 178 Poplar High Street, where the long line of the great road ran east from the city toward the gates of the East India Docks, and where the trade of the day was constant from before dawn until late into the evening. It was at the Poplar High Street shop that they spent the longest of their years together. The shop was a small 2-story building, with the eating house upon the ground floor and a small set of 3 rooms above, and a small narrow yard behind in which Elisabeth kept a small wooden tub of red geraniums in the summer months, and a small line of washing strung between the back wall and the small wooden gate. The kitchen above was warm. The fire in the small iron grate burned at all hours. The kettle hissed upon the hob. And in the small front room, with its small window looking down upon the busy traffic of Poplar High Street, John and Elisabeth Stride spent the small slow evenings of their married years, reading the daily papers, mending their working clothes, counting the small heavy copper takings of the day, and speaking together in the slow quiet manner of a man and a woman who had learned to keep each other's company without need of many words. There were no children. There had been hopes in the first year or two of children. Elisabeth was still a young woman, only 26 when they began the shop on Crisp Street, and the small hopes had been there. But no child came. There were small sorrows. There were small visits to the small parish doctor in the next street, who told her, after the second of the small sorrows, that the chancres of the Gothenburg years had perhaps left more harm in her body than the small grey salves had ever set right, and that she ought not to hope too much for the small thin cry of a child in the upper room of the house on Poplar High Street. She did not hope too much after that. She worked. She kept the shop. She cleaned the long deal tables. She washed the heavy white china. She counted the small copper coins. She walked, on the Sunday afternoons, down to the small Swedish church in Mitre Square, in her grey Sunday dress and her small black bonnet, and she sat through the long Lutheran service in the small dim light of the gas lamps, and she sang the small slow hymns in the small slow Swedish that she had learnt as a girl in the parish school at Torslanda. She wrote her small slow letters home to her father in the small careful Swedish hand that had become almost a foreign hand to her now. And she received in return the small slow letters that told her of the small slow turnings of the farm at Stora Tumlet. The years went on. The shop went on. John Stride was 45 years old in the year 1875. Elizabeth was 32. The small store of savings that they had kept in a small tin box beneath the bed had grown, and shrunk, and grown again, and shrunk again, in the slow way of the small businesses of the East End. There had been a year or two of fine trade. There had been a year of thin trade. There had been a small fire in the kitchen of the shop in the winter of 1873, in which the small copper urn had been damaged, and from which the shop had taken some months to recover. And by the late summer of 1875, after 5 and more years at the small house on Poplar High Street, John Stride had begun to grow tired. He was no longer a young man. His hands, which had once been steady at the carpenter's bench, were no longer quite so steady. His back ached from the long hours of bending over the small iron stove. His eyes troubled him in the small, dim gaslight of the shop. He had begun to cough in the early mornings, a small, dry cough that he wiped from his lips with a small grey handkerchief, and that he did not name to his wife. In the autumn of that year, an offer was made for the shop. A young man named John Dale, who had worked for a small while in the kitchen of the shop, and who had learnt the trade well, came to the Strides one evening with a small written offer in his hand. He would take over the shop. He would take over the lease, and the small fittings, and the small goodwill of the trade. He would pay them in cash, the sum of £40, and he would take on the small running of the trade from the first day of the month that followed. John Stride sat for a long time over the small offer, in the small front room above the shop, with a small lamp burning low between him and his wife. He spoke quietly. He spoke of his cough. He spoke of his eyes. He spoke of the slow weight of the years of the coffee urn upon his back, and in the end, by the small flickering light of the lamp, he and Elizabeth came to an agreement between them. They would take the offer. They would sell. The small wooden sign with their name painted upon it in white was taken down on a cold grey morning in the November of 1875. The Strides' coffee rooms, after only 5 in a small years of trade, ceased to be. John Dale moved his small belongings into the upstairs rooms. The Strides moved theirs out, into a smaller and meaner set of rooms, upon a smaller and meaner street nearby, and the small store of £40 was put into the small tin box beneath the new bed, and John Stride looked for work once more at the carpenter's bench of a small commercial yard along the river. He did not find it easily. The trade had moved on. The yards now wanted younger men, with stronger hands and clearer eyes. The cough that had begun in the small kitchen of the Poplar High Street shop did not leave him. It grew worse. Slowly, through the long wet winter of 1876, and worse again through the long cold spring of 1877, and by the March of that second year, the small tin box beneath the bed had grown thin and light, and the small rent of the small new rooms had fallen behind. Elizabeth Stride applied in the March of 1877 to the relieving officer of the parish of Poplar, and she was admitted, for a small short time, to the great brick workhouse upon the long high street of the parish. She did not stay long. She came out again within the month. But the great wooden door of the workhouse had been opened to her, for the first time in her life, and a small slow door of another kind had begun, in the small dark winter of her marriage, to close. Chapter 7. The Princess Alice and the Lies She Carried. There was a day in the September of the year 1878 that the city of London would not forget for many generations after. And although Elizabeth Stride was not, by any honest record, upon the waters of the Thames upon that day, the story of that day would come to belong to her name in the small dim lodging-houses of the East End for the rest of her short and shadowed life. The day was Tuesday, the 3rd of September. The weather had been fine. A small pleasure steamer of the London Steamboat Company, named the Princess Alice, had been making her usual summer journey up and down the long brown river of the Thames, carrying day-trippers from the small piers of the city down to the small pleasure grounds of Rocherville, near the town of Gravesend, where the working families of London could walk among the flower-beds and the small fountains for the price of a single shilling each, and where the brass bands played upon the lawns from the early afternoon until the long pale evening. The Princess Alice was an old vessel by the small standards of the river. She had been built more than a dozen years before upon the River Clyde in the Kingdom of Scotland, and she had been worked hard for many long summers upon the brown waters of the Thames, with her 2 great paddle wheels turning upon her sides, and her tall black funnel pouring its small grey smoke into the evening sky. She was a side-wheel steamer of the old fashion. She was perhaps 220 feet long. She could carry, by the small mercies of her certificate, some 400 passengers in any single voyage. But on the evening of that Tuesday in September, with the long bright summer drawing slowly to its close, she had taken upon her decks some 700 souls and more, and they had stood and sat and laughed together along her long wooden rails as she steamed slowly back up the river toward the city in the slow gold light of the evening. She did not reach the city. A little above the small reach of the river called Tripcock Point, where the Thames bends sharply to the north between the marshes of Plumstead and the small chalk cliffs of the Essex shore, the Princess Alice met, in the long, slow turning of her course, a great iron collier of 900 tons that was steaming down the river toward the open sea. The collier was called the Bywell Castle. She was the larger ship by far. She'd been bringing a cargo of coal up from the port of Newcastle, and she was returning empty to the north for another load, and she had no thought in all the wide brown water of the river that any small pleasure steamer would cross her path upon that evening. There was a small hard signal of a whistle. There was a small slow turning of the wheel. There was a small low grinding of iron upon wood. The great bow of the Bywell Castle struck the small wooden side of the Princess Alice just behind her starboard paddle box, and the small old steamer was cut almost in two by the blow, and within 4 short minutes she had broken apart, and she had sunk beneath the brown water of the Thames, and the 700 souls upon her decks had been thrown into the river together. Few of them can swim. Few of the working women of London learned to swim in those years. The river at that point was full of the small dark drainings of the great sewers of the city, which were pumped out into the Thames at the small outfall at Crossness, only an hour or two before the collision, and the water was not the clean salt water of the lower estuary, but a thick foul brown soup of human waste and factory effluent, rotting matter from the small slaughter-houses upstream. The bodies of the drowned were lifted from that water for many days afterward, by the small boats of the river police and by the small boats of the watermen of Greenwich and Woolwich, and they were laid out in long slow rows upon the wet stones of the dockyard at Woolwich for the small slow business of identification. Some 650 souls died upon that evening. It was, by the small bitter reckonings of the kingdom, the worst loss of life in any single accident upon any inland water of all Great Britain. The newspapers of the following days were filled with the small details of the dead. There were husbands and wives. There were small children. There were grandfathers and grandmothers. There were small parties of friends from the small streets of Bermondsey and Limehouse and Bow. There was, in particular, a great number of working-class women who had taken their small children for the long bright day at the pleasure gardens, and who would never again walk up the wooden stairs of their own front doors. Elisabeth Stride was not among them. By that summer of 1878, she and John Stride were no longer keeping any small coffee shop in any small street of Poplar. They had been out of the trade for nearly 3 years. John had been growing weaker with each long passing month. His cough had worsened. He had been admitted, in the small early months of that year, to the Poplar sick asylum, where the parish doctors had told him, in the small slow Latin of the wards, that he was suffering from the slow disease of the lungs that was then called phthisis. Elisabeth had been in and out of the small lodgings of the parish, and in and out of the small workhouse, and in and out of the small charitable arms of the Swedish church at Mitre Square. She had been living, in those years, on a small thin charity from the pastor of the church, who had known her since her first arrival in London more than 10 years before, and who gave her a small weekly allowance of 2 shillings and 6pence for the rent of her small lodging. She was, on the evening of the 3rd of September in 1878, nowhere near the River Thames at the reach above Tripcock Point. She was, by all small honest reckonings, in her small rented room in some quiet back street of Poplar or Bow, drinking her small thin cup of weak tea, and reading the small evening newspaper by the small light of a small tall oak candle. But she read of the disaster in the days that followed. She read of the small lost women. She read of the small lost children. She read of the small slow business of identification at the dockyard. And somewhere, in the small slow turning of her thoughts, in the small dim room of her small thin life, a small thought began to take shape. It is not known when she first told the story. It is known only that, by the early years of the 1880s, she had begun to tell it. She told it to the women of the lodging-houses. She told it to the small charitable visitors of the parish. She told it to the men who bought her a small glass of gin in the public houses of Whitechapel. She told it in the small, slow Swedish accented English that she had learnt in the kitchen of the house at Gower Street, and she told it always in the same small, careful order, with the same small, careful details, as if she had been telling it to herself for many years before she ever told it to any other living soul. Her husband, she said, had been upon the Princess Alice. He'd been upon the boat that fine September evening with their 2 small children, returning home from a small day's outing at Rocherville Gardens. She had not been with them. She had been ill that day and had stayed at home. The collision had come. The boat had sunk. The 2 small children had been pulled down into the dark water and had not come up again. The husband had been pulled down too, but he had risen once more, and he had swum a small way through the foul brown river, and he had been kicked in the mouth by another swimmer who was struggling for his own life, and the kick had broken his teeth, and he had drowned in the end among the bodies of the others. She had lost, that day, a husband and 2 small children of her own blood. She herself, who would in some tellings be aboard the boat after all, had been kicked also in the same wild scramble, and the kick had broken some of her own teeth and had given her, ever afterward, a small, slow stutter that came out in moments of fear. It was a story of many small, flowering details. It was a story that grew, with the small, slow telling, into a story of 9 children, of whom 7 had drowned, or 6 or 5, by the small turnings of the telling. It was a story that brought her small coins from the kind women of the lodging-houses, and small glasses of gin from the kind men of the public-houses, and small extra allowances from the kind pastors of the Swedish church. It was a lie. It was an entire lie, from the first small word to the last. She had borne no 9 children. She had borne no living children at all. Her husband had not been upon the Princess Alice. Her husband, John Thomas Stride, was, in the years that she told the story, still alive in the small wards of the Poplar sick asylum, coughing himself slowly to his small final breath in a small iron bed beside a small grey window. He would die there at last, of the slow disease of the lungs, on the 24th of October in the year 1884, 6 full years after the small evening at Tripcock Point. He would be buried in the small paupers' ground of the parish of Bromley. His name would not appear upon any list of the drowned of the Princess Alice. It would appear only upon the small careful register of the parish workhouse, and upon the small grey stone of the small grey grave. By the time that he died, Elisabeth had not seen him for some years. The small marriage of St. Giles in the Fields had quietly come apart, in the slow steady manner of all the marriages of the East End, in the long thin years between the selling of the coffee shop and the long final illness in the workhouse infirmary. There had been no formal parting. There had been no decree of any small court. There had been only the slow drifting away of 2 tired people who had each grown too thin and too poor to keep the small fire of the small home alight any longer, and who had each gone their own slow ways through the small lodging-houses of the East End, and who had stopped, in the end, even writing the small letters that married people write to one another in the long absences of poverty. She had become, in the small bitter joke of the lodging-houses, a widow before her husband was dead. She had carried, by the time the small news came to her of his small final breath in the Bromley workhouse infirmary, her small lie of the Princess Alice, for so many years already that the small lie had grown around her like a second skin, and she could no longer tell where the small lie ended and where the small truth began, and she could no longer tell where the small lie ended and where the small truth began, and she could no longer remember whether the small 2 children at the bottom of the river had ever been her children at the ball, or West Kiden or Creefinst. She wept when the small news came. She wept in the small kitchen of the lodging-house on Devonshire Street. She wept for the husband she had not seen in 3 years. She wept for the children she had never borne. She wept for the small farm at Storetum Lehed, which she had not seen in 20 winters. She wept for the small bells of the Domkirken at Gothenburg, which she would never hear again. And when at last she had finished weeping, she dried her small grey eyes upon the corner of her small grey apron, and she went out into the small wet street, and she walked the long walk east toward the small lodging-house upon Flower and Dean Street, where the small 4-penny bed was waiting for her in the long dim dormitory beside the kitchen. Chapter 8. The Rookery of Flower and Dean. The small street called Flower and Dean was one of the oldest streets in the small east of London, and it had been, by the year that Elisabeth Stride first turned the corner into it, one of the very worst. It ran for a small short distance, no more than the length of a furlong, between Commercial Street upon the west and Brick Lane upon the east, and it lay in the small dim heart of the parish of Spitalfields, where the great pale walls of Christ Church rose above the small narrow lanes, and where the small wooden looms of the old French silk weavers had once turned all day in the upper rooms of the old houses. The silk weavers had gone long before. The looms were silent. The old houses, which had been built in the time of Queen Anne and the early George, had been carved up by the small landlords of the parish into the cheapest lodging houses in the kingdom, and the small fine carved doorways and the small fine sash windows of the better days had all grown black with the slow soot of the East End coal smoke, and the small Dutch tiles upon the kitchen walls had cracked and yellowed, and the small wooden floors of the upper rooms had grown soft with the damp of 100 years of rain. The Metropolitan Police, in the small careful reports that they made each year to the Home Office, had described the small street called Flower and Dean as perhaps the foulest and most dangerous thoroughfare in all the city of London. The constables of the H Division, who patrolled the parish of Spitalfields, walked the small street only in pairs and only in daylight. After dark, they did not enter it at all. The small narrow turnings that led off it on either side into the small dim courts of Wentworth Street and Thrall Street and George Yard were known by the small dark name of the Rookeries, and within them lived together a small population of perhaps 1,000 souls, in lodging-houses where the beds were rope-strung along a wall, and in cellar-rooms where the family slept upon piles of dirty straw, and in upper attics where the windows had no glass and the wind came through in the long cold months of winter, as if there were no wall there at all. Number 32 upon the small street of Flower and Dean was one of the larger of the lodging-houses. It had been, in the better years of the previous century, a respectable house of the merchant class, with a small wooden parlour and a small panelled hall and a small narrow garden behind. The garden was gone. The parlour had been turned into the kitchen of the lodging-house, with 2 long deal tables and a great iron range upon which a great copper kettle hissed at all hours of the day. The hall had been turned into the small reception-room, where a small wooden counter stood and where the small landlord or the small landlady received the small 4pence of each lodger each evening before the doors were locked at midnight. The upper rooms had been turned into the long dormitories, with small iron bedsteads ranged along the walls like the small berths of a ship, and small thin mattresses of horsehair upon them, and small grey blankets of cheap wool that had not been washed in a great many seasons. The house was kept, in the years that Elizabeth Stride came to know it, by a kindly woman named Elizabeth Tanner, who was perhaps 50 years of age, with grey hair pinned up beneath the small white cap, and small spectacles balanced upon the small bridge of her small nose. Mrs. Tanner had kept the house for some 7 or 8 years. She knew her lodgers. She knew their names. She knew the small particular ways in which each one of them had come to be poor. She did not turn out a lodger who could not pay, if the lodger had paid faithfully in the weeks before. She did not raise the rent in the cold months. She kept a small store of dried herbs in the kitchen cupboard for the small fevers of the winter, and she made a small thin broth in the great copper kettle for the lodgers who were too sick to walk out into the streets. It was to Mrs. Tanner's house that Elizabeth Stride came, by the slow turning of her years, in the early part of the year 1882, after the small final breaking apart of the small marriage in Poplar, and after the small slow drift through the small lodging-houses of Bow and of Spitalfields that had filled the long years between. She came one cold March evening, with her small carpet bag in her hand and her small grey shawl pulled tight against her shoulders, and she paid her small 4pence at the small wooden counter, and she signed her name in the small lodger's book, in the small slow loops that she had practised long ago in the attic at Gower Street. Mrs. Tanner looked at the name. She looked at the woman. She saw the small grey eyes, and the small dark curly hair beginning to be touched with grey, and the small careful manner of speech, and the small slow Swedish accent that the years in the East End had not quite worn away. She asked the new lodger her name, and the new lodger replied that her name was Elizabeth Stride, but that the women of the house might call her Liz if they pleased, or Long Liz if they pleased, for that was the name by which she had come to be known in the small lodging-houses of the parish. The name was a small mystery in itself. She was not, by the small honest reckoning of the tape, a particularly tall woman. She was 5 feet and 5 inches in her bare feet, which was no great height in the kingdom even in those years. Some said that the name had come from her married surname, for a stride is a long step, and the small joke had grown up around it. Some said that it had come from the small long shape of her face, with its long thin jaw and its long thin cheeks. Some said that it had been given to her in small mockery, for she was no taller than the small thin Irish girls of Spitalfields, and the small mockery had stuck. No one knew for certain. The name only stayed. She was given a bed in the upper dormitory, upon the women's floor, where some 20 other women slept each night in the small ranged iron bedsteads. The bed cost her 4p a night. The 4p had to be paid before the door of the house was locked at midnight, or the bed would be given away to another. The lodger was permitted to use the kitchen between the hours of 5 in the morning and 10 in the evening. The lodger was permitted to bring in food and to cook it upon the great iron range. The lodger was permitted to wash herself in the small tin basin in the small backyard, with water drawn from the small iron pump beside the kitchen door. The lodger was not permitted to bring in any drink stronger than small beer, although the rule was not always kept. The lodger was not permitted to bring in any man, and the rule was kept more strictly than the first. She settled in those first years into the slow rhythm of the place. She rose at 6 in the morning. She washed her face at the small tin basin. She combed out her small dark curly hair before the small cracked square of mirror that hung upon the kitchen wall. She put on her small black bonnet and her small black wool jacket, and she went out into the small streets of Spitalfields and Whitechapel, looking for the small day's work that would pay the small 4p of the next night's bed. The small day's work was hard to come by. There were no factories now that she could enter. There were no respectable houses now that would take her on as a serving maid, for she was a woman of 40 years and more, with the small grey beginning to show in her dark hair, and with the small wear of the East End beginning to show in her grey eyes, and the housekeepers of the small respectable streets wanted only the small fresh young Irish girls of 17 and 18, who would work for less and complain less. There was small piecework. There were the small sacks of brown paper that were brought down from the small paper mills of Bow, which the women of the lodging houses sewed together with a small needle and a small length of brown thread for the price of a single penny 100. There were the small bundles of matches that were brought down from the great match factories of Bromley, which the women of the lodging houses fitted together into small boxes for the price of a single penny, a gross. There was the small charing work, which meant the small scrubbing of the small back stairs and the small back kitchens of the small respectable houses that lay along the commercial road, for the price of 6p a half-day. She did all of these. She did them in the slow, steady manner of the woman she had always been. She walked the long miles of the East End each morning with a small basket in her hand, and she returned each evening with a small handful of small copper coins, and she paid her small 4p at the small wooden counter of the lodging-house, and she ate her small thin supper of bread and cheese in the small smoky kitchen, and she went up the small wooden stairs to the small iron bed in the long dormitory. She drew, too, upon the small thin charity of the Swedish church at Mitre Square. The pastor of the church, who had grown old in his small parish, and who remembered the small young woman who had come to him in the summer of 1866 with her small carpet bag and her small Swedish letters, gave her a small allowance of perhaps a shilling each week, which he wrote down in the small charity book of the church beside her small careful name. He gave her also a small grey blanket each winter, and a small pair of black wool stockings, and a small bag of dried herrings at the Christmas season. He spoke to her in the slow careful Swedish that they had once shared, of the small turnings of the old country, of the small news from Gothenburg, of the small news from the Feineberg, of the small letters that came across the North Sea from the parishes of the West. She thanked him each Sunday with a small slow nod of her grey head, and she walked back through the long miles of the city to her small bed in the lodging-house with the small shilling pressed warm in the inner pocket of her small black wool jacket. The years went on. The bells of Christ Church Spitalfields rang above her in the small grey mornings. The smell of the small wet cobbles of Flower and Dean Street rose to her in the long dark nights. The faces of the other women in the small upper dormitory came and went in the slow turning of the small lodging-house, with the small thin Irish girls, and the small thin English girls, and the small thin English girls, and the small thin Polish Jewesses passing through the small iron beds beside her own. Some stayed for a single winter. Some stayed for a single week. Some went out one morning and never came back, and their small bags were left in the small reception room until they should be claimed, and they were not claimed, and they were given away in the end to the small new women who came in their place. Elisabeth Stride came and went. She left for short stretches when she could find a man who would take her in, and she returned when the small short stretches came to their end, and Mrs. Tanner each time wrote her name back into the small lodger's book, and gave her back her old bed in the upper dormitory, and the small, slow rhythm of the place closed quietly over her once more. The small fourpence of the night's bed was earned each day by the small day's work that she could find in the small streets of the parish. The small, slow Sunday walks to the Swedish church at Prince's Square continued. The small letters home to Torslanda grew rarer with each passing season. And in the small, quiet years of her life in the rookery, between the small departures and the small returns, the small, slow figure of a man at last began to enter the small, slow story of her days. Chapter 9. The Last Companion and the Last Days in the spring of the year 1885, when Elisabeth Stride was 41 years of age and had been 3 full winters in the small lodging-house upon Flower and Dean Street, there came into her small life the last of the men whose names the small histories of her would remember. His name was Michael Kidney, and he was a waterside labourer of the small docks at Wapping, and he was 9 years her junior. He had been born, by the small reckoning of his own small papers, in the year 1852, somewhere in the long crowded parishes of the East End, although the small papers were not entirely clear upon the point, and he spoke in the slow flat accent of the river trade that had no particular county to it. He was a man of middle height, with a small dark beard and a small dark moustache, and he wore the small rough clothes of the dock trade, with a small blue jersey under his small brown jacket, and a small soft cap of grey wool pulled low above his brow. He worked, when he worked, at the small unloading of the small coastal traders that came in to the small wharves of Wapping and Shadwell, lifting the small barrels of beer and the small sacks of grain from the holds of the small ships to the small wooden cranes upon the quays. He earned, when he worked, perhaps 3 shillings and 6pence in a good day, and perhaps 1 shilling and 6pence in a bad. He did not work upon every day. He drank, upon the days when he did work, the greater part of what he had earned, in the small public houses of Cable Street and the Ratcliffe Highway, before he ever came home to the small rented rooms in which he lived. It is not certain how Elisabeth Stride and Michael Kidney came to meet. The small accounts say only that, by the late spring of the year 1885, they were known to one another, and that by the early summer of the same year, they had agreed between them to take a small set of rented rooms together upon a small street called Devonshire Street in the parish of Mile End Old Town, and that Elisabeth had left her small bed at Mrs. Tanner's lodging-house upon Flower and Dean, and had moved her small carpet-bag of small belongings down the long mile of the Whitechapel road to the small new rooms of her small new life. They were not married. They did not pretend to be married before any small clergyman of any small parish. They lived together in the small fashion of the East End, as so many of the small couples of the docks lived together in those years, without any small certificate from any small church, and without any small ring upon the small finger. They called themselves, when they were asked, Mr. and Mrs. Kidney. They paid their small rent each week to the small landlady of the house. They quarrelled. They quarrelled often. The quarrels were always over the same small thing, in the small slow turning of their years together, and the small thing was the drink. Michael Kidney drank his shilling each evening at the small public houses of the river. Elisabeth Stride drank her 6pence when she had it at the small public houses of Spitalfields. They drank together upon the small Saturday evenings when his small weekly pay had come in, and when her small charring work had brought in the small shillings of the week. And when the small drink was finished, and the small money was gone, they quarrelled in the small rented rooms upon Devonshire Street, and they shouted at one another in the small dim gaslight of the small front room, and the small landlady upon the floor below would knock upon her own ceiling with the small handle of her small broom, to bid them be quiet, and they would grow quiet for a small short while, and then the small quarrel would begin once more. Elisabeth would leave him, in the manner of all such partings. She would walk out of the small front door of the rooms on Devonshire Street, with her small carpet-bag in her hand, and she would walk the long mile back to the small lodging-house of Mrs. Tanner upon Flower and Dean Street, and she would sign her name once again in the small lodger's book, and take her old bed in the upper dormitory. She would stay for a week. She would stay for a month. She would stay for a small short season, and then she would gather her small bag once more, and she would walk the long mile back along the Whitechapel road, and she would knock upon the small front door of the small rented rooms on Devonshire Street, and Michael Kidney would open the door, and they would look at one another in the small wet evening, and she would come in, and the small slow turning of their small life together would begin again. It went on like that for 3 full years. It went on through the summer of 1885, and the long winter of 1886, and the summer and the winter that followed, and through the small turning of the year into 1888. The small quarrels grew no less, and the small departures grew no rarer, and the small returns grew no less faithful. Michael Kidney, when he was later asked about her in the small courts of the parish, would say, in the slow, steady manner of his East End speech, that it was the drink that made her go away, and that she always returned without his ever needing to go after her, and that he believed, in his small honest reckoning, that she had liked him better than any other man. It was perhaps so. It was perhaps not so. The small records do not say. The small records say only that she came and went, and that he opened the door, and that the small, slow years turned over their small, slow page each season. Through all of those years, there were the small appearances at the small bar of the Thames Magistrates' Court, at the small police court upon the Arbour Square in Stepney, where the women of the East End were brought up in the small grey mornings to answer for the small drunkennesses of the previous evening. Elisabeth Stride appeared at that small bar, by the small careful counting of the court clerks, no fewer than 8 times in the small space of 20 months. She was always charged with the same small thing. She was drunk, the small constable said, and disorderly in some small public house of the parish, and using obscene language in the small hearing of the customers. The magistrate, who knew her by sight by the 3rd or 4th appearance, would look at her over his small spectacles, and would shake his small head slowly. He would fine her 5 shillings, which she could not pay. He would commit her, in lieu of the fine, to the small house of correction at Holloway for the small term of 7 days. She would do the 7 days in the small grey ward of the small grey building, and she would come out again upon the small Saturday morning, and she would walk the long miles back through the city to the small lodging house upon Flower and Dean Street, and she would sign her name once again in the small lodger's book. Upon a Saturday night of the September of that year, only a small while before the small last night of her life, she was once again arrested in this manner by a small constable of the H Division at the door of the Queen's Head public house upon the Commercial Street, where she had been drinking with some small companions for the most of the evening. She was taken to the small police station upon the Bishopsgate Street, and she was kept in the small cell there until the morning, and she was released upon her small recognizance to appear at the magistrate's court upon the following Monday. She did appear. She was fined the usual sum, and her small charge being a first offence within the 6 months previous, the magistrate let her go upon the payment of a small portion of the fine, which a small kindly woman in the small public gallery paid for her upon the small condition that she would not drink again upon the Commercial Street for the small remainder of the month. She walked back to the small lodging house in the small bright noon of the Monday. Mrs. Tanner gave her her old bed. On the Tuesday morning, which was the 25th of September, she made the long walk back along the Whitechapel Road to the small rented rooms upon Devonshire Street, to see Michael Kidney once again. He was at his work at the small wharves at the time of her coming. The small landlady of the house let her in, and she sat for a small while in the small front room, and she warmed her small grey hands at the small iron grate, and she wrote a small note upon a small scrap of brown paper, which she left upon the small deal table beside the grate for him to find when he came home in the evening. The small note has not survived. The small landlady, who was later asked, said only that she had seen the small writing upon the small scrap of paper, and that it had been in the small slow loops of a careful hand. She did not know what it had said. She thought, in her small later telling, that perhaps it had said that Elisabeth was going away for a small time, and that Michael was not to come after her. She thought also that perhaps it had said something more or something less. She could not be sure. Michael Kidney, when he came home in the wet evening, read the small note in the small light of the small iron grate. He sat for a small while at the small deal table. He drank a small glass of gin from the small bottle upon the kitchen shelf. He did not go after her. He had not gone after her in any of the small previous partings, and he did not go after her now. He went up the small wooden stairs to the small empty bedroom, and he closed the small door behind him, and he did not see Elisabeth Stride again upon any small evening of his small remaining life. She returned to Mrs. Tanner's lodging-house on the small Wednesday morning. She paid her small fourpence at the small wooden counter for the next night's bed. She set down her small carpet-bag upon the small iron bed in the upper dormitory. She washed her small grey face at the small tin basin. She went out in the small grey afternoon to look for the small day's work that would pay the small fourpence of the night that followed. She worked upon the small Wednesday and the small Thursday and the small Thursday at the small cleaning of the rooms of the lodging-house itself. Mrs. Tanner had given her this small piece of work, in the small kind manner that she had always shown to the women of her house when the small day's work could not be found elsewhere. The pay was a small sixpence the day, which was 3 of the small fourpences of the night's bed. On the Saturday, which was the 29th of September, the small piece of work came to an end. The small rooms had all been cleaned. Mrs. Tanner paid her a small last sixpence in the small kitchen of the house, with the small smell of the small evening's pea soup beginning to rise from the great iron range. Elisabeth thanked her with a small, slow nod of her grey head. She went up the small wooden stairs to the small upper dormitory. She washed her small face at the small tin basin once more. She combed out her small, dark, curly hair. She put on her small, long black jacket of cheap wool and her small black bonnet, and she pinned to the small breast of her small jacket a small bunch of red and white flowers that a small Irish girl in the next bed had given her that morning as a small kindness. She came down the small wooden stairs of the lodging-house at a small 7:45 in the evening. She walked out into the small wet street of Flower and Dean. She turned her face toward the east and she walked into the falling rain. Chapter 10. The Voices on Berner Street. She walked east from the small lodging-house. She passed the small dark passage of Thrall Street, and the small grey corner of Wentworth Street, and the small wet expanse of the Aldgate East Road, and she turned at last into the long broad thoroughfare of the Commercial Road, where the small gas lamps were lit at their long intervals along the wet cobbles, and where the small slow rain was falling once again from a low grey sky. The Commercial Road in those years was one of the small great arteries of the East End. It ran in a long straight line from the small junction at Whitechapel High Street in the west to the small docks of Limehouse and Poplar in the east, and along its length were strung the small public houses, the small chandleries, the small tobacconists, the small pawn shops, and the small pawn shops, and the small lodging-houses of the river trade. The small workmen who unloaded the ships at the West India docks walked it each morning before dawn. The small sailors who came in upon the small steamers from Hamburg and Stockholm walked it each evening after the boats had docked. The small Jewish tailors who worked the small dark rooms of Spitalfields walked it home in the small late hours of the Sabbath. And tonight, in the small wet evening of the 29th of September in the year 1888, Elisabeth Stride walked it east in her small black bonnet and her small black jacket and her small pinned bunch of red and white flowers, looking for some small further pleasure than the small lodging-house upon Flower and Dean Street could afford her. Some way down the long road, before one reached the small turning that ran down to the great gates of the London Hospital, there was a small narrow street that turned south. It was called Berner Street. It was a small ordinary street of the East End, lined with small narrow houses of 3 stories, and it ran for the short distance of a single furlong down to the small parish of St. George in the east and the small wharves of the river beyond. It was a street of small, respectable workmen. There were small Jewish tailors there, and small German cobblers, and small Russian shoemakers, and a small school for the children of the parish, and a small board of works office, and a small public house at the corner, and halfway down the street upon the eastern side, the long brick face of a building that the parish knew well. This was the International Working Men's Educational Club. It was a small socialist club, founded some few years before by a small group of Jewish workmen of the parish, mostly Russians and Polish émigrés who had come to London in the small flight from the troubles of their own countries. The club had its rooms at number 40 Berner Street, in a small 2-story building that had once been a Christian mission. The ground floor was a small lecture room with rows of wooden benches and a small raised dais at one end. The upper floor was a small social room, with a small piano and a small bar, and a small set of long deal tables where the members ate together upon the Saturday evenings. Beside the club, opening directly off the street through a small wooden gate, ran a small narrow passage called Dutfield's Yard, where in the daytime a small van and cart builder named Mr. A. Time. Dutfield worked at his trade, and where in the night the gate was sometimes left open and sometimes locked, according to the small turning of the day. It was toward this small street that Elisabeth Stride now turned her steps. She was first seen by any small witness whose name has come down to us at a small 11:45 in the night. There was a small labourer of the parish, a quiet man named William Marshall, who lived at number 64 Berner Street, and who was standing in the small front doorway of his lodging at that hour for the small purpose of taking the small air before the bed. He saw upon the opposite side of the street, in the small shadow of a small doorway at number 63, a man and a woman standing together. They were not still. They moved toward one another. They embraced. The man kissed the woman upon her mouth, in the small, slow manner of a man who knew her well. The woman replied with some small word that Marshall did not catch. The man laughed in a small, slow, careful manner, and he said to her, in a small, slow voice that just reached across the small, wet street, the small, strange words that William Marshall would remember for the rest of his living days. "You would say anything," the man said, "but your prayers." The woman laughed in her turn. They walked together, slowly, southward along Berner Street, toward the small gate of Dutfield's yard. Marshall watched them go. He stood for a small while in his doorway. He took out his small play pipe, and he lit it with a small match, and he watched the small smoke curl up into the wet air. And then, the small hour of midnight beginning to chime upon the small bells of Christchurch Spitalfields far in the distance, he turned indoors, and he went up the small wooden stairs to his small bed. When he was later asked by the small officers of the Metropolitan Police to describe the man he had seen, William Marshall did so in the small, careful manner of a working man giving evidence. The man, he said, had been of middle age and stout, and of perhaps 5 feet and 6 inches in height. He had been clean-shaven. He had had the appearance by the small set of his shoulders of a clerk. He had worn a small black cutaway coat of good cloth, and dark trousers, and a small round cap of dark wool with a small sailor-like peak above the brim. He had been respectably dressed. He had not looked like a working man. He had not looked, Marshall said, like the small, ordinary kind of man who walked Berner Street upon a Saturday evening at all. At about the same hour, or perhaps a small quarter of an hour later, there was a small shopkeeper of the same street, a small fruiterer named Matthew Packer, who kept a small shop at number 44 Berner Street, and who afterward told the police that a man and a woman had stopped at his small window upon that evening and had bought from him a small bunch of black grapes for the price of 3d. The man had paid the 3d. The woman had taken the grapes in her small grey hand. They had walked away together down the street. Packer's small account would later prove a confused one, and the small officers of Scotland Yard would not in the end be quite certain whether the small bunch of grapes had been sold at all, for no small trace of the grapes was found upon the body, and no small trace of the small skins was found upon the cobbles of the yard. But the small fruiterer had remembered the small purchase, or had thought that he had remembered it, and his small name was added in the small, careful hand of the police clerk to the small growing list of those who had seen the Swedish woman alive that evening. At 12:30, when the small bells of the city had rung the small half-hour above the wet roofs of the East End, there came along Berner Street a small constable of the H Division named William Smith. He was walking his beat in the small, slow manner of all the constables of the parish, with his small tin lantern hooked to his belt and his small wooden truncheon swinging gently at his side. He saw, upon the opposite side of Berner Street to the small gate of Dutfield's yard, a man and a woman standing together against the small dark wall of a small lodging-house. The woman, he afterwards said, had been wearing a small black jacket and a small black bonnet, and there had been pinned to her breast a small bunch of red and white flowers. The man had been with her, very close. They had not seemed to be quarrelling. They had seemed only to be talking quietly together, in the small, slow manner of two people who knew one another, but who were perhaps not quite settled in their meeting. Constable Smith described the man, when later asked, as being some 5 feet and 7 inches in height, and as being of perhaps 28 years of age, and as having a small dark moustache, and as wearing a small hard felt hat of the kind that the small clerks of the city wore in those years, with a small narrow brim and a small soft crown. He had been wearing a dark overcoat, fitting closely about him, and dark trousers. He had been carrying a small parcel wrapped in newspaper, perhaps 18 inches long, and 6 or 8 inches across, and tied with string. Smith had thought it a small parcel of some shopkeeper's wares. He passed them by. He continued his beat. He turned the small corner at the foot of Berner Street and walked on into the next quiet length of street. At 1:45 in the morning, when the small last quarter hour before the great hour of 1 had just begun to turn, there was a small labourer of the parish named James Brown, who was walking home along Fairclough Street after his small late supper at a small fried fish shop on the corner. He saw a woman standing in the small doorway of the Board of Works building, in the small dark angle where Berner Street met Fairclough Street, and a man standing close beside her. The woman, he afterward said, had been wearing a small dark jacket and had been carrying nothing in her hands, and he thought, in his small honest remembering, that she had been the woman whose body was later found. Although he could not be quite sure, he heard the small voice of the woman speak to the man as he passed. "Not tonight," the woman said. "Some other night." He walked on. He turned into Fairclough Street. He went home. At the very same quarter hour, or perhaps a small moment before, there was a small Hungarian Jew of the parish, a small man named Israel Schwartz, who was walking south along Berner Street upon his way home to his small lodging on the next street over. He spoke no English. He had been not many months in the country. He saw, as he turned into the small street, a man walking some short distance ahead of him along the same pavement. The man stopped at the small gate of Dutfield's yard, where the small lamp of the yard cast a small dim circle upon the wet stones. He spoke to a woman who was standing there. The woman replied. The man took her by the small shoulders. He pulled her, with a small sudden violence, into the street. She screamed. She screamed 3 times. She did not scream loud. The screams were the small thin screams of a woman who is being hurt, but who did not wish to draw any great attention upon herself. Schwartz stopped. He stood in the small wet street. He looked upon the small scene before him. He saw upon the opposite pavement a second man standing in the small light of a small public-house doorway, smoking a small clay pipe. The man at the gate looked up. He saw Schwartz upon the pavement. He saw the second man with the pipe, and he called out in a small loud voice the small single word that Schwartz did not understand at the time, but that he would later be asked to repeat carefully again and again before the small officers of the police and the small clerks of the coroner's court. Lipski, the man called. It was a small Polish-Jewish word, or perhaps a small Polish-Jewish name, or perhaps a small term of insult that the man had thrown across the street at the watchers. The second man, with the pipe, took his small clay pipe from his mouth, and he began to walk slowly toward Schwartz upon the pavement. Schwartz, in his small fright, turned and ran. He ran south along Berner Street. He ran into Fairclough Street. He ran into the small dark passages of the parish. He did not stop, he afterwards said, until he had reached the railway arch upon the next great street, and he had hidden himself in the small dim recess beneath the iron beams of the arch, and he had listened, with his small heart beating against his small ribs, for the small sound of footsteps coming after him in the wet street. There were no footsteps. The second man with the pipe had not followed. The first man at the gate had not followed either. The small wet street of Berner had grown quiet once more, and the small lamp at the small gate of Dutfield's yard had burned on as if nothing at all had happened beneath it, and the small woman who had screamed 3 times had vanished from the small light of the lamp. The hour of 1 in the morning had begun to chime upon the small distant bells of Christ Church. Chapter 11. The Pony that Refused the Yard. The man who came at last into Dutfield's yard, in the small hour after the screams had died away upon Berner Street, was not a constable of the police, nor a watchman of the parish, nor any small officer of the small night patrols of the East End. He was a small Russian Jew or small tradesman of the small streets, a man named Louis Diemschutz, who was the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club that stood beside the yard. He had been away from the small club all the long Saturday. He had risen at 4 in the small dark morning of that same day, and he had hitched his small barrow to his small pony in the small backyard of his small house, and he had driven the small cart out of the East End and through the small grey streets of the city, and he had gone the long 10 miles to the south, to the small market at Westhow Hill, near the great glass building of the Crystal Palace at Sydenham, where each Saturday the small wars to the small crowds of the Leshers gathered to sell their small wares to the working families upon their day of leisure. He had taken with him, in the small wooden boxes upon the cart, a small store of cheap costermonger jewellery, the small brass rings and the small tin earrings, and the small glass beads and the small wooden brooches that he had bought from a wholesaler in Aldgate for a small handful of shillings, and that he hoped to sell at the small market for a small handful of shillings more. It had been a thin day. The rain had fallen for most of the long afternoon. The small crowds at the small market had been few. The small jewellery had not sold well. By 6 o'clock in the evening, with the small dusk beginning to fall over the south of the city, Louis Diemschutz had folded up his small wooden boxes, and he had put away his small painted sign, and he had climbed back upon his small barrow, and he had turned the small head of his small pony toward the long road home. The road home was a long road. It ran north through the small parishes of Camberwell and Bermondsey, across the river by the long iron bridge of the tower, and east into the small dim streets of the East End. It was not a road for the small, fast-travelling. The small pony was tired by the long day. The small cart was heavy with the small unsold stock. The small rain was falling once again from the small low grey sky, and the small cobbles of the long road shone under the small gas lamps of the city. He stopped, somewhere upon his long way, at a small tobacconist's shop upon the commercial road, to buy a small twist of dark tobacco for his small clay pipe. He noted in the small careful manner of a man returning from a long day's trade the small hour upon the small clock above the tobacconist's counter. It was 8:20 before 1 in the morning. He paid his small twopence. He climbed back upon his small barrow. He drove on. He came into Berner Street at the small hour of 1 o'clock in the morning. The small wet street was empty. The small gas lamps burned at their small intervals along the cobbles. The small windows of the small houses were mostly dark, although the small upstairs windows of the workingmen's club, halfway down the street upon the east side, still glowed with the small soft light of the gas lamps within, where the small meeting of the small members was still drawing slowly to its small end. He heard faintly the small voices of the singing inside the club. He heard faintly the small notes of a fiddle. He drove on past the small front of the club, and he turned the small head of his small pony toward the small wooden gate of Dutfield's yard, where the small dim passage opened into the small dark space behind the club. The small pony stopped. It did not stop in the small ordinary manner of a tired pony at the end of a long day. It did not stop with the small lowering of the head and the small slow blowing through the small wet nostrils. It stopped instead with a small sudden shying of the head and a small sudden turning of the small body to the left, away from the small gate of the yard. The small pony would not move. It would not pass through the small gate. The small Russian Jew in the driving seat clucked his small tongue. He shook the small reins. He spoke to the small pony in the small soft Russian that he kept for the small animal alone. The small pony did not move. It stood with its small head turned to the left, in the small wet street, with the small rain falling on the small dark hair of its mane. Deemschutz leaned forward in his small seat. He looked into the small dark passage of the yard. He could see, very faintly, in the small dim light that came through the small upstairs windows of the club, a small, dark shape upon the ground, close to the small wall, just within the small gate. The small shape was long and low. It might have been a small bundle of rags. It might have been a small drunken man, sleeping off the small Saturday gin in the wet darkness of the passage. The small Russian Jew lifted his small whip from its small stand beside the seat. He leaned forward over the small head of the small pony. He prodded at the small shape upon the ground. The small shape was soft. The small shape did not move. He prodded a small second time. He lifted the small whip, and he tried with the small handle to lift the small edge of what might have been a small dark skirt. The small dark skirt would not lift. There was a small weight upon it that the small whip could not stir. He climbed down from the small seat. He stood in the small wet passage of the yard. The small darkness was very thick there, away from the small gas lamp of the street, and he could see almost nothing of the small shape at his feet. He took from his small waistcoat pocket a small box of safety matches, and he drew one of the small matches out, and he struck it against the small rough side of the box. The small flame leapt up. He bent low. The small flame found, first, the small grey wool of a small black jacket. It found the small pinned bunch of red and white flowers above the breast, the small petals just beginning to drop in the small wet. It found, then, the small pale face of a woman, with her small dark curly hair fallen across her small grey forehead, and her small grey eyes wide open and looking straight up into the small wet darkness above her, and her small mouth a little parted. It found the small silk handkerchief about her throat, slightly torn at one side. It found, beneath the small handkerchief, the small long clean cut that ran across her small throat from beneath the small left ear to a small point below the small right jaw, perhaps 6 inches in all. Very clean, very straight, and very deep. The small dark blood was still flowing from the cut. It was running slowly down the small grey side of her small neck, and it was pooling in the small wet hollow beside her small head, and it was beginning to creep in a small dark thread toward the small open drain that ran along the small wall of the yard. The match went out. Louis Diemschutz stood for a small short moment in the small darkness. He drew a small breath. He turned away from the small body upon the ground. He stepped back out through the small gate of the yard. He climbed up onto the small seat of his small barrow once more, and he drove the small few yards along the front of the club to the small kitchen door, and he tied the small reins around the small iron post beside the door, and he opened the small door, and he went inside. The small upstairs room of the club was bright after the small wet street. The small gas lamps burned along the small walls. The small members of the meeting were standing about in small groups, in their small dark coats and their small black caps, talking quietly in their small mixture of Russian and Yiddish and broken English. The small fiddler was packing away his small fiddle into its small wooden case. The small singer was wiping his small mouth upon the back of his small hand. Diemschutz crossed the small room slowly. He went up to a small group of men who were standing near the small bar. He spoke to them in the small soft Yiddish that he kept for the small members of the club. He told them that there was a small dead woman lying in the yard. He told them that he had thought at first that she was only drunk. He told them that he had struck a small match and that he had seen her throat. The small men stared at him. One of them, a small tailor named Isaac Kosebrodsky, took up a small light in a small tin holder from the small bar. Another, a small printer named Morris Eagle, who was the small chairman of the meeting, took up a second small light. They went down the small wooden stairs together. They went out into the small wet street. They turned through the small gate of Dutfield's yard. The small lights burned low against the small wet wind of the passage, but they held. The small light of the small twin flames fell upon the small body. The small members of the club drew in their small breaths together. Morris Eagle, without a small further word, turned upon his heel and ran out into Berner Street, and he ran north toward the small junction with the commercial road, looking for a small constable of the police. He found one within a small few minutes at the small corner of Grove Street, in the small person of Police Constable Henry Lamb of the H Division, who was walking his slow beat along the small wet pavements. Eagle gave the small alarm. Lamb ran with him back along Berner Street. They came into Dutfield's yard together. Lamb knelt beside the small body. He felt the small wrist for the small slow beat of the pulse. There was no small beat at all. The small face of the woman was already cooling in the small wet air, but the small body was warm. The small constable laid the back of his small hand against the small cheek. The small cheek was warm. He laid the back of his small hand against the small breast beneath the small black jacket. The small breast was warm too. The small dark blood that was still creeping in the small slow thread toward the open drain of the yard was warm to the small touch. The small woman could not have been dead for more than 10 minutes. Perhaps less. Perhaps very much less. The small constable looked up sharply. He looked about the small dark yard. He looked at the small wooden gate which had stood open all the small while. He looked at the small dim corners of the passage where the small lamp of the upstairs club-room threw small shadows against the small brick walls. He thought, in the small swift thought of a constable upon his beat, what every small constable would have thought in the small same instant. The small murderer had been there only minutes before. The small murderer might still be there even now, hiding in the small darkness of the yard, or in the small woodshed against the small back wall, or behind the small piles of wood shavings beneath the small workshop of the cart builder. The small murderer might be watching them. He blew his small whistle. The small thin sound of the whistle rose into the small wet sky above Berner Street, and it carried far down the small wet streets of the parish, and within a small few minutes the small constables of the H Division were converging upon Dutfield's yard from every small direction, in their small tall blue helmets and their small long blue coats, with their small lanterns swinging at their belts and their small wooden truncheons drawn ready in their small hands. They searched the small yard. They searched the small woodshed. They searched the small workshop. They searched the small upstairs rooms of the club. They searched every small corner of every small turning. They found nothing. The small murderer, if he had ever been there, was gone. Louis Diemschutz, who had stood by the small body of the woman through all of the small searching, leaned at last against the small wall of the club beside the small gate, and he passed a small wet hand across his small wet face. The small thought came to him then, in the small dim circle of the lantern light, that when he had first turned the small head of his small pony into the small gate of the yard, only a small few minutes before, The small murderer had perhaps been still there in the small darkness beside the small body, only a few feet away from him, watching him strike the small match and bend low. He thought that, if he had not gone into the club to seek his wife, but had instead raised the small alarm at once in the small wet street, the small murderer might have been taken in the small yard before he could escape. But he had gone into the club to seek his wife. And the small murderer, if he had ever been there, had walked out of the small gate while Diemschutz was inside, and he had walked away into the small wet streets of the East End, and he had vanished from the small lantern light of the small constables of the H Division, as a small draught of cold air vanishes from beneath a small closed door. The body of the small woman lay where it had fallen, beneath the small light of Morris Eagle, in the small wet passage of Dutfield's yard, while the small constables searched the small parish around her. The small bunch of red and white flowers upon her breast was beginning to wilt in the small rain. Chapter 12. Mitre Square and the Question That Will Not Rest. While the small constables of the H Division were searching the small dark corners of Dutfield's yard, and while the small body of Elisabeth Stride lay cooling upon the wet stones beneath the small wilting flowers, a small second event was beginning to unfold in another small part of the small city. 3/4 of a mile to the west of Berner Street, beyond the long line of Aldgate High Street, beyond the small open square of the Aldgate pump, beyond the small grey gate that marked the small ancient boundary between the parish of Whitechapel and the city of London itself, there lay a small dark square called Mitre Square, hidden behind the small turning of Mitre Street. It was a small old square. It had once, long ago, been a part of the small grounds of the Priory of the Holy Trinity, in the days before the great King Henry had broken up the small monasteries of the kingdom. The priory was gone. The small monks were gone. The small square was now ringed by small warehouses and small offices and one small empty house, and it was used in the daytime by the small carmen of the city as a small place to turn their small wagons. In the night, the small square was empty, and it was very dark, and only a single small gas lamp burned at one of its small corners, throwing a small dim circle upon the worn cobbles. It was into this small square, at a small few minutes before 2 o'clock in the morning of the 30th of September, that a small woman walked, in the small wet rain, from the small direction of Aldgate High Street. Her name was Catherine Edways. She was 46 years of age. She had been born in the iron and coal town of Wolverhampton, far to the north, and she had come to London as a young woman of perhaps 14 years, and she had spent her small grown life in the small lodging houses of Spitalfields with a small man named John Kelly, who was a labourer of the small markets. She had been arrested in the small early evening of the Saturday for being drunk and disorderly upon Aldgate High Street, and she had been held in a small cell of the Bishopsgate police station for the small purpose of sobering up, and she had been released at 5:50 past midnight, upon her small giving of a small sergeant at the desk. She had walked east from the police station, in her small black bonnet and her small dark green skirt and her small white apron, toward the small lodging house at 35 Flower and Dean Street, where her small companion John Kelly was waiting for her. She had not reached the small lodging house. She had been seen at 5:30 past 1 in the morning, at the small entrance of a small passage called Church Passage that led into Mitre Square from Duke Street, by 3 small men of the parish, 2 cigarette makers named Loender and Levy, and a small furniture dealer named Harris, who were leaving a small workmen's club upon Duke Street after the small Saturday meeting. She had been standing, the 3 small men said, with a man at the small mouth at the passage, and she had had her small hand upon his small chest in the small slow manner of a woman, who was quietly bargaining over a small price. The 3 men had walked on. They had not looked very closely at the man. He had been of medium height, with a small fair moustache, and he had worn a small cloth cap with a small peak, and a small loose jacket, and a small red neckerchief. It was the smallmost that they could afterwards say. 10 minutes later, at 1:45 in the morning, a small constable of the City of London Police, named Edward Watkins, walked into Mitre Square upon his slow beat. He had walked the same beat 15 minutes before, and the small square had been empty then. He carried his small bull's-eye lantern in his small hand, and he turned the small beam of the lantern upon the small dark corners of the small square as he walked. The beam of the lantern fell, in its small slow turning, upon the small southwestern corner of the square. It found her. She was lying upon her back, with her small head turned to her small left shoulder and her small skirts thrown up about her waist. Her throat had been cut. Her belly had been opened from the small breastbone to the small bone of her pelvis. Her face had been cut. Her small intestines had been pulled out and laid in a small soft pile upon her small right shoulder, and a small piece of them had been cut away and was missing altogether. A small kidney had been taken from her body. A small piece of her womb had been taken too. Her small earlobes had been notched in a small, careful triangle. Her small lower eyelids had been nicked. Constable Watkins did not approach her. He turned from the small square. He ran across the small open cobbles to the small door of a small warehouse at the eastern corner, where he knew a small night watchman to be on duty, and he beat upon the small door with his small fist, and he cried out for help. The small watchman came at once. The two men went together back across the small square, and they stood beside the small body, and the small watchman blew his small whistle, and the small constables of the City of London police came running through the small wet streets with their small lanterns and their small truncheons, exactly as the small constables of the H Division had run, an hour before, through the small wet streets of Whitechapel. By the small dawn of that Sunday morning, before the small light had yet broken upon the slate roofs of the city, the small news had begun to travel through the small lanes of the East End. There had been 2 murders in the night. There had been 2 women killed within an hour of one another, less than a mile apart. The small papers, when they came out on the small Monday morning, would call it by the small dark name that the parish itself was already using by the small Sunday afternoon. The double event. The hand that had killed Annie Chapman 3 weeks before, and Marianne Nichols 3 weeks before that, had walked the small streets of Whitechapel again, in the small hours of the Sabbath morning, and had taken with it 2 small lives instead of 1, and had vanished once more into the small fog of the parish without a small trace. A small inquest into the small death of Elisabeth Stride was opened upon the Monday morning at the small vestry hall in Cable Street, by the small coroner of the parish, Mr. Wynne Edwin Baxter. It sat for 5 long days. It heard the small evidence of Louis Diemschutz, and of Mrs. Tanner, and of Michael Kidney, and of William Marshall, and of Constable Smith, and of James Brown, and of Israel Schwartz, and of the small surgeons who had examined her body in the small mortuary of St. George in the east. The small jury, at the small end of the 5 long days, returned the small verdict that was to be expected, of wilful murder by some person unknown. By some person unknown. The small phrase has stood in the small books of the parish for nearly 140 years. The small person was never known. The small hand was never named. The small murderer of Elisabeth Stride, whoever he was, walked out of Dutfield's yard in the small minute before Louis Diemschutz turned the small head of his small pony into the gate, and he walked away into the small wet streets of Whitechapel, and he passed beyond the small reach of any small constable, and any small clerk, and any small parish, and he was not seen again. There has been, in the slow years that followed, a small long debate. The small Whitechapel murderer, it has been said, did not kill Elisabeth Stride. The small evidence does not quite fit. Her throat was cut with a knife that the small surgeons thought was not pointed and sharp like the others, but round and broad and perhaps an inch across at the blade. There were no small further mutilations upon her body. The small place where she was killed was the most public of all the small killings of that autumn, with the lights of the small club still burning above her, and the small voices of the small singing members still rising faintly through the small wet walls, and the small risk of discovery had been very high. The man whom Israel Schwartz had seen attacking her had not looked like the small man whom the small witnesses had described in the other small killings. The whole small thing, some have said, was perhaps not the small work of the Whitechapel murderer at all. It was perhaps the small work of another man entirely, a man who had quarrelled with her in a public house, a man who had followed her down Berner Street in the small wet evening, a man whose name has long since been lost, and who killed her for the small private reasons of his own. There has been, in the same slow years, an equal small voice upon the other side. The small Whitechapel hand, it has been said, did kill Elisabeth Stride. The small disturbance by Louis Diemschutz, the police themselves had said upon that very Sunday morning, was the small reason that the small body bore no small further mutilations. The small killer had been interrupted, the police had said, only a small moment after he had drawn the knife across her small throat. The small fury that had been denied to him in Dutfield's yard, the police had said, had been carried by him through the small streets of the parish to Mitre Square, only 40 minutes later, where he had spent it upon the small body of Catherine Edoes, in a manner more terrible than any of the small killings before. Which is the small truth, no one can now say. The small witnesses are dead. The small constables are dead. The small coroners are dead. The small surgeons who bent above her in the small mortuary at St. George in the east are dead. The small jury that brought in the small verdict of wilful murder by some person unknown is dead. The small Russian Jew who struck the small match in the small wet darkness of Dutfield's yard is dead. Even the small pony who shied to the left in the small lamplight and would not pass through the small gate has long since gone to its small rest. Elisabeth Stride was buried upon the 6th of October in the year 1888 in the small paupers' ground of the East London Cemetery at West Ham, beneath a small unmarked piece of earth that no small stone was set above. The funeral was paid for by the small parish. There were no small Swedish letters that came to the small graveside from the small farm at Stora Tumlade, for the small father, Gustaf Eriksson, had died some years before, and the small brothers and sisters had long since lost the small trail of their small sister who had crossed the North Sea more than 20 winters before. The small pastor of the Swedish church at Mitre Square came to the small graveside in his small black gown, and he read the small Lutheran prayer in the small slow tongue that she had once known as a girl in the parish school of Torslanda. The small earth was thrown in slowly. The small grave was filled. The small few mourners walked away through the small wet grass of the cemetery. She had been 44 years old. She had crossed a sea. She had kept a small coffee shop. She had told a small lie about a small ship in the river. She had loved a quiet carpenter and a quarrelsome dock labourer, and perhaps a young constable of whose name the small histories have no record. She had walked the small streets of the parish in the rain. She had earned her small fourpences. She had paid her small fourpences. She had sat through the long Lutheran services at the small Swedish church. She had pinned, upon the small last evening of her life, a small bunch of red and white flowers above her breast, and now she lay in the small unmarked earth of West Ham. Above her the small grass grew. Above the grass the small autumn winds turned the small leaves of the small lime trees. Above the trees the small grey sky of England, with its long slow drifts of cloud, moved on, and would not stop. The small question of whether she had truly been a victim of the small unnamed hand of Whitechapel had not been answered. It would not be answered. The small file in the small offices of Scotland Yard would lie open for many years more, and would never be closed, and the small clerks of 100 years would write their small careful papers upon it, and they would argue, in the small slow turning of the small evenings of a long century, over the small length of a blade, and the small angle of a wound, and the small ispa of a Hungarian Jew who had run from a small gate in the small rain. The small woman herself was beyond the small argument. She had passed out of the small reach of the small parish. She had passed into the small place where small histories cannot quite follow. The wet streets of Whitechapel were quiet again. The small gas lamps burned low along the cobbles. The small bells of Christ Church Spitalfields rang the small last hour of the night above the small slate roofs. And somewhere, in the small dim heart of the small parish, the small slow turning of the small dark autumn went on, as it had gone on for 100 autumns before, and would go on for 100 more, in the slow even breathing of a small old city that had seen a great many small things in its small long days, and that would not now remember them all.